in the middle of a frozen and unrecognizable city, where all the infrastructure was plunged into darkness, and transportation was completely stopped. An urgent report arrived. The news was shocking. The Earth had entered a new ice age, advancing at an alarming rate. A brave reporter fighting against the cold held his frozen microphone, while he informed the world that temperatures would continue to fall, with no signs of stopping. However, he tried to encourage people not to lose hope. With his fists clenched, he assured that the government had not abandoned the population, and that if they remained united, they would overcome this unprecedented crisis. Just as he was about to continue with his message of unity, a frozen plane forced an emergency land, crashing into the reporter and his team. A man watched this last broadcast through a screen, almost completely frozen, after the accident that had left the news network in ruins. In a few seconds, the television signal was interrupted, and everything went to static, without any further coverage on the fate of the city. Our protagonist Feng's room reflected the portrait of someone who fought, but finally gave in. He hadn't bothered to clean up the mess left by the few provisions he had left. Around the entrance, boxes of useless objects and scarce supplies were piled up. Outside, someone shouted his name in desperation. After a long time, Foam, upon hearing the call, rose from his icy apartment, took a steel bat, modified with nails and with traces of blood still visible, and headed towards the door. He looked disheveled, covered in the winter coat he could get his hands on, though it still wasn't enough to face the extreme cold. Cautiously, he looked through the peephole and was left speechless. It was a woman he knew very well, even before the Ice Age began. She was also wearing a thick coat, but being exposed to the outside, her face was red and her body was visibly shaking. Foam, slightly blushing, opened the door. The woman was Juina, and he didn't understand what had brought her to his door. Still with the bat in his hands, he invited her in, seeking to offer her a warmer and safer place. The world outside was becoming more and more dangerous. Juina, with unexpected force, pushed the door and quickly entered the room. In the blink of an eye, she was hugging and kissing him passionately. Her small hat even fell to the floor due to the speed of the movement. Foam, surprised, didn't back away, and his cheeks turned red. That long and ardent kiss continued much longer than one would expect. When they finally separated, both were breathless and saliva dripped from their mouths. The world was crumbling, but there they were. Realizing what had just happened, Foam immediately pulled away, and with his breath catching, he asked Juina what had led her to act in such a way. While trying to catch his breath, she confessed that she had finally understood that he was the man she had loved all this time. Tears began to well up in her eyes as she told him that he should have been by her side all this time. Juina wanted to prove that what she was saying was genuine, so she took Feng's hands and pressed them against her chest so he could feel the accelerated beat of her heart. She promised that she was willing to do whatever was necessary so they could be together. Upon hearing those words, any vestige of rationality disappeared from Feng's mind, and he didn't have time to react. Then he stared at Juina, who was gently caressing his face. At that, he confessed to her that what she had just said meant everything to him. However, he knew that the threshold of the door was not the right place to continue with this. But Juina sweetly cut him off, asking him not to speak anymore, only wishing that he would close his eyes and enjoy the moment, without his logical mind interfering. Foam closed his eyes. Then, with a lost look, he asked her what should happen next. At that instant, another man appeared, forcefully opening the door. Quickly, this stranger dealt him a mortal blow. With a blunt object, Foam had no chance to defend himself. His skull was shattered in a second, while still keeping his eyes closed. It was a savage attack, sudden and bloody, that covered the entrance with blood. Juina and the strange man entered the apartment. She was trembling and stuttering, as if she couldn't believe that her accomplice had really killed Foam. He reprimanded her, telling her to stop acting surprised, since she knew there was no other possible outcome. The world had already fallen into the abyss, and one less to feed wouldn't change anything. The most disturbing thing was that Foam didn't die immediately. He lay on the icy floor, suffering indescribable agony, as blood gushed from his wound, and froze instantly. Although he didn't understand what had happened, he couldn't move. In his final moments, he saw the mysterious man and Juina flirting near his lifeless body. She was being touched in ways that only he could imagine. while he was promising to reward her for her performance. That had made the whole plan possible. When Fong closed his eyes for the last time, hatred towards that cold-hearted woman took over him, an unbearable burden. He swore that if there was a new life, he would not let himself be trapped by a blind passion. In the total darkness that enveloped him, Fong began to see small lights. At first, they were tiny, but soon they grew, until they became something larger and brighter. As it illuminated, Fong wondered what was happening. He instinctively extended his arm, and his skin seemed translucent, as if it were a different entity. The warm light attracted him, after enduring the cold of the real world. But then the golden light transformed into red. As he approached that light, something, or at least the image of his body, felt as if his limbs were tearing apart, as if he was being crushed. Nothing seemed to go right in his life in a short time. The crimson light covered his entire body, while a cry of agony escaped his throat. Fong woke up startled, drenched in cold sweat, and screaming, as if he was being chased. The pain was so intense that it seemed real. He remembered being lured into closing his eyes, struck on the head because of his greed, and he had died in a rather miserable way. Then he woke up in absolute darkness, and now he didn't even know where he was. He looked around, and the sunlight shone brightly through his window. His soft and comfortable bed was impeccably made, and fresh air filled the room. As he opened the curtains, Fong was far from that cruel world that he had already grown accustomed to. It took him a while to assimilate the strange events he had lived in the last few hours. He spent those 30 minutes enjoying the beautiful view of his neighborhood. From his apartment, he couldn't help but marvel at the bright sun, since he had truly missed it. He checked the date and saw that it was the morning of June 28th. According to his memories, the Ice Age apocalypse would begin on July 15th. He was supposed to die in an ambush, but somehow he had transported himself to the past, half a month before the end of civilization. Although he retained the memories of the previous timeline, there was something different this time. Something strange was happening in his body, maybe in his hands, since his awakening. A red light constantly enveloped his right hand. He tried to shake it off, but nothing made it disappear. It didn't hurt, it just felt warm. At first, he thought it was just his imagination. Fong was so absorbed in his thoughts, while looking out from his balcony, that he suddenly began to sneeze. Upon wiping his nose, he noticed that the red light in his hand had mysteriously changed to an intense green. Then something happened that made him panic. The hand that was now glowing green began to lengthen. Its bones, flesh, and skin seemed to stretch, trembling with fear and confusion. Fong quickly ran towards his room and closed the balcony door as fast as he could. Just before something stranger happened, he went inside. He was breathing heavily, but his hands seemed to have returned to normal. However, the green glow was still there, persisting as always. As he watched, he noticed beams of light emanating from his hand. How could modern science justify something like this? After what had happened outside, his hand began to shrink slowly. The green light seemed somewhat erratic, enlarging and contracting unpredictably, unlike the red one, which remained fixed. This phenomenon remained a mystery. Suddenly, while sitting on his sofa, Fong felt an overwhelming exhaustion. He hadn't done much more than run inside, but he felt completely depleted. It probably had something to do with that strange green light. Frustrated, he began to move his arms back and forth, trying to find some explanation for what it was. Then he remembered the Manhwa stories that he loved to read so much. In those tales, the protagonist always reborn like him. Maybe he would gain some kind of supernatural power, like in the books. Then he decided to test it. He went to the kitchen, took his sharpest knife, and raised it hopefully. After waiting a while without anything happening, Fong scratched his head, embarrassed. The knife didn't even react to the light emanating from his hand. So concentrated, he was on discovering if he had acquired any magical power that he forgot about his exhaustion and how hungry he was. Now he was only thinking about food. Unfortunately for him, the Fong of the past, who had no idea what was about to happen, was a complete slacker who didn't even have decent food in his refrigerator. The situation was becoming increasingly desperate. He had never experienced a feeling of hunger so intense. If he didn't eat something soon, he would most likely faint at any moment. That's when his gaze fell on the living room, where he saw a transparent jar with some soy snacks. They were simple roasted soybeans that he had bought before the apocalypse. He took one of the soybeans without thinking. Using his right hand, completely forgetting the strange green light that enveloped. The need to eat was so urgent that he wasn't thinking about anything else. He put it in his mouth, hoping to at least get some food, but the instant the bean touched his tongue, an explosion of smoke was unleashed in front of his face. The fog created almost completely covered his upper torso. To his amazement, upon chewing, he discovered that he was biting a bean stalk. It was as if the roasted bean had begun to sprout. In his mouth, he could feel the roots on his tongue, while the stalk elongated outside of his mouth. He pulled it out, and the earthy taste it left was unmistakable. Of all the strange experiences he had had lately, this one undoubtedly occupied one of the top spots. He was about to eat some simple soybeans, and now this was happening. Besides, he no longer felt hungry. It seemed that the explosion of smoke had completely erased the feeling of emptiness in his stomach. At that, he looked at his right hand, and to his surprise, the green light had disappeared. Maybe all of this had something to do with what happened with the soybean. He decided to take one of the pods from the stalk and observe it closely. Upon opening it, he confirmed that there was only one soybean seed, fresh and common. Perhaps this was the power he had wished for. He didn't know what kind of ability this was, but it was certainly something worth investigating. Although he still had many questions, he couldn't waste time analyzing this phenomenon. While he felt the hunger dominating him, he had something more urgent in mind: to get food before the world came to an end. For the first time in a long time, Phong could leave his apartment, feel the sun on his skin, and hear the birds singing. He walked among the crowd that filled the streets of a mall. As he walked towards his destination, his thoughts were full of confusion. First, the red light surrounding his hand had transformed into green. Now the light seemed to shrink and expand, affecting his body, making his heart beat faster, and causing him inexplicable fatigue. When he touched the soybeans, they sprouted in his mouth like a stalk. He looked at his right hand, still full of doubts, wondering what kind of power he had acquired, and who knows why. In the middle of his distracted walk, he heard a familiar and sweet voice calling him, a voice that would have melted him before, but that now provoked indescribable anger in him. Phong didn't recognize her immediately and turned to see who was calling him. It was the woman who had killed him cruelly. With a wide smile, impeccably made up, she hid her true, rotten nature. She asked him if he was also shopping, and, cunningly, used her tricks to appear as attractive as possible, as if fate had wanted them to meet there. Phong had not yet assimilated everything that had happened, but seeing Juina on the street began to revive the bitterness he had kept until his last breath. Juina had once been the goddess of his dreams. For 3 long years, Phong was a fool who did everything in his power to make her happy. He knew he would never be more than a simple friend to her, but he still gave himself completely. He wasn't even in the friend zone. He was just someone to turn to, a resource bank. For all those years of effort and money wasted on the wrong person, he never imagined that she would be the reason why he almost lost control of himself. To remain calm, Phong pinched himself, struggling to stay calm. He thought clearly and understood that now was not the time to seek revenge. At least not yet. He had priorities, and the main one was to make sure he had provisions, unless he wanted to end up again, hungry and miserable during the deadly cold era. Juina approached him and moved her hand in front of his eyes, asking him why he was so distracted. This had never happened before, since normally just hearing her voice, he would melt like a fool. Phong repressed the hatred he felt towards her and forced a smile, apologizing for seeming lost in his thoughts and highlighting how impressive she looked this time. She shone so brightly that he couldn't help but get absorbed for a moment in her presence. "That's more like it," Juina said with a flirtatious smile, asking him when he had become so soft with his words. At that moment, she gave the final blow. With her most charming pose, Juina invited Phong to go shopping together, even though they had already met by chance. However, Phong knew that he had reached his limit with her. He couldn't keep facing her without losing control of his anger. So he continued walking and apologized, saying that they wouldn't go shopping together this time. Juina was completely surprised, since that was not what she had planned. She had hoped to get some free things from a gullible fool. While walking in the opposite direction, Phong couldn't help but recognize the girl's cunning. But this time he wasn't going to fall into her game. He was no longer as naive as before. So he went directly to his target, the Waldemar shopping center. the largest and most complete supermarket in the eastern region. It was comparable to a Walmart, but with its own brand. Feng knew that when the Ice Age came, that place would be empty overnight. In the previous timeline, no one had discovered who had taken everything or how they had done it. Feng began his shopping marathon, filling his cart with essential supplies. He needed to stock up as much as possible before society crumbled under the relentless cold. While walking through the aisles, he consulted some internet forums on survival guides in case of an apocalypse, and to his surprise, the recommendations were quite useful. While going through them, he noted the things he would need like food, winter clothing, medicines, daily necessities, fuel, tools, transportation, and even weapons. There was a lot to prepare, but he was so excited about getting supplies that he forgot about the biggest problem he had. The current balance of his personal wallet was barely 15,000 yuan, which is equivalent to just over $2,000. How was he going to secure a safe and comfortable life in the icy apocalypse? With so little, he would need much more money for everything he was going to need. At that moment, suddenly, a message notification appeared on his phone. A notification. That could be the way the heavens were telling him to calm down. The message came from an organization called Money Jar Loans, congratulating him for being approved to obtain a loan of up to $23,000. A light bulb went on in his mind. There was no need to panic about funds. How could he forget that the convenience of technology had brought him an infinite glitch of money? There are dozens of loan applications that require minimal requirements to get a loan, approved for those who are desperate for money. They are incredibly predatory, but going into debt doesn't matter, since he won't have to pay them back. After the apocalypse reaches its peak, in the shopping district, a woman was kicking an empty soda can on the sidewalk, clearly annoyed. It turned out to be Juina, who didn't seem to be in a good mood at all. Her eyes were full of toxic venom. Since today, one of her many simps dared to reject her when she had fixed herself up to be pampered. She was really furious that Feng had simply left without letting her empty his bank account like a useless leech. She began to insult the guy in her mind for being a pathetic loser who didn't even have a car. Her angry walk was interrupted by a loud honk from an approaching car. Curious, she turned to see what was going on. It looked like a new pickup truck fresh out of the dealership, still shiny and with a premium look. Feng was rolling down the windows from the driver's seat. He had stopped to greet her, since he had casually passed her while she was taking her walk of shame through the shopping district. Upon seeing the new wheels, Juina's vow not to ever be nice to Feng again apparently vanished. From her mind, all she saw were new leather seats and the smell of money. Feng got out of the car. When she asked him if the car was his, he answered in the affirmative, adding that he had acquired it that very morning. He approached the witch and made up a story about how his father had been very successful in business in the United States, so he had some money to spend. He even added that he had just left the airport after dropping off his father. Juina's face lit up. The only thing that could make that happen would be the possibility of getting rich. So she took a deep breath and put on her game face for Feng. This is the second time she's done this today. She looked at the floor and began to tremble slightly, knowing that Feng had taken his wealthy father to the airport. That day, she began to apologize for asking him to go shopping, without knowing that he would have such a busy schedule. Then the tears began. She began to conjure those tears at the perfect moment, while timidly telling Feng that he had been so cold with her before, that she thought he was abandoning her as a good friend. Feng smiled with satisfaction. This performance, worthy of the Academy, would have worked wonders with the him of the past. But things were different now. With surprising speed, he took her by the waist and pulled her closer, while with his other hand he held her chin, looking directly into her eyes. Juina was surprised to see that one of her admirers had such audacity. Feng, with an impeccable performance, promised her that he would never leave her, that she was too important to him to do something so cruel to her. For a brief instant, a fleeting, twisted smile appeared on his face, but he quickly erased it, returning to his role of a sweet and sincere boy. It was as if he was throwing his best card. Juina, disarmed by the situation, admitted that Feng was also special to her. She even invited him to lunch and see a movie, so she could get to know him better. But just when she was going to wait for a response, Feng had already vanished, as if the wind had taken him away. It was a quick and silent exit. A bewildered Juina was left speechless. Her confession, which had been so sincere, ended up being addressed only to nothing, since Fong was playing his own way. While she stood there, Fong was already in the back of his truck, piling up boxes, and joking about how overwhelmed he was with the shopping and his busy schedule. Clearly, she was annoyed by the failure of her manipulation attempt. Juina, without losing her composure, continued to act like the sweet and nice girl she always was, asking why he had bought so many things. Fong answered her with a calm smile, saying that it was nothing out of the ordinary. He had just picked up some items he liked, further fueling the girl's frustration. To add salt to the wound, he lied enthusiastically and told her that he had also bought a gift for her. Seeing that she could no longer manipulate him, Juina said goodbye with a gesture and continued on her way home, smiling, with a false hope that maybe she would receive her gift. But the moment she turned around, a cunning smile appeared on Feng's lips, knowing that she had fallen into his game again. While Juina thought she had managed to manipulate her simps, Feng was having fun in his own way, knowing that he couldn't let her discover his true plan. His small stockpile of supplies was crucial for his survival. He knew that when the apocalypse came, she would have to wait her turn. Like everyone else, Feng would make sure that, just like the stranger who hit him on the head, she would receive what was due to her. The anxiety about the impending collapse of society was beginning to dissipate. In fact, Feng was beginning to look forward to what was coming. June 9th arrived quickly. July 15th would be the beginning of the end, the day that would change everything. First, the snow would fall in torrents, followed by a drastic drop in temperatures that would reach minus 20 degrees Celsius. Over the course of a month, Feng knew that the key was to make sure he had enough supplies before everything fell apart. The first thing he took care of getting was large quantities of food. Besides the quantity, he made sure that everything was well packaged and sealed. He couldn't allow his neighbors to suspect what he was doing. No one should know that he was hoarding so many provisions. The work was exhausting, especially when he had to move the more sensitive supplies under the cloak of darkness, when there was no one around to see him. He also knew that once the apocalypse began, the electrical grid would be extremely unstable. So his latest acquisition was crucial. A heavy-duty generator with enough fuel to keep it running for at least a year. With power secured, now he had to consider the fatal consequence of the building's heating system stopping working. He had to call some specialized contractors to modify his house and make it independent in terms of heating. Feng also ordered some reinforced doors and windows. While he was at it, he needed a dedicated room to store all the supplies he had accumulated. So he used an empty room for all the essentials. When he finished preparing everything he had listed in his little survival notebook, it was already July 14th. Just one more day before the temperature plummeted and everything fell into chaos. The next thing on his list was the main event that he had been postponing out of insecurity. All this time, it was time to focus and study his mysterious ability. Feng prepared a homemade meal for dinner while thinking about his survival in the impending Ice Age apocalypse. When things get tough, depending only on the supplies he has hoarded won't be enough. But he has a possible solution to this problem. His power to manipulate plants in some mystical way could be his only hope for a sustainable future. The food he cooked had soy as its main ingredient. That's right, the same beans he had created from a single roasted snack. Using his ability, he racked his brain and tried so many gestures and possible triggers, but the lights still didn't come out. The activation is so random that finding the correct trigger is almost impossible. For now, it's time for a risky taste test. He needs to make sure that the food created by his abilities is edible. Who would say that trying some beans would be so distressing? Feng ate half the plate of beans without any apparent problem. Even the soy milk passed the taste and safety test. While chewing his lunch, the confirmation that his ability could provide edible food was a total game changer. At least, that showed that he has the ability to generate food, at least theoretically. The next step is the most difficult, and based on trial and error, he needs to figure out how to actually use the lights, red and green, and make them appear at will. So far, he had only tried it with soybeans, but what if he could use it with other things? Opening his newly stocked refrigerator, Feng strengthened his resolve to experiment and see if his ability would work with other plants as well. The testing period extended from noon until the sun was about to set. Fong didn't know that. While he was fainting in the middle of experimentation, slowly opening his eyes, he noticed that he was holding something tightly with his right hand, a green vegetable of some kind, a huge broccoli. Slowly, he got up from the floor and didn't care at all about the absolute mess that was in his kitchen, since the pain in his head was hellish. He felt as if something was pounding from inside his skull. He had to take note of this feeling for the future. This power of his has a severe cost for the mind and body, and cannot be used without restrictions, unless he wants to pass out and wake up with migraines. Every day, after getting up, he immediately took a spoonful of his beans to recharge his energy again. Perhaps he had pushed himself to the limit that day, but at least he learned something vital about this mysterious ability of his. A few hours before passing out, he had carefully organized a diverse selection of products on the kitchen floor. He tried to use his power with some of them. After managing to activate the green light, some root crops, like potatoes, did not react at all to his green light for some unknown reason, but not all were failures. Some of the crops went through the germination process to become complete plants, like the soybean stalks. Wheat was one of those cases. Although some failed to grow as expected and, instead of developing, they exploded in his hands like small bombs. The experience was terrifying and left Fong surprised. After those explosions, the plants transformed into a light substance that, although it looked like charcoal, had a very different appearance. This phenomenon was definitely outside of his predictions. Fortunately, he found a use for those black substances, not suitable for human consumption. By grouping them together and lighting them in a container, they could generate heat similarly to coal. Coming from a future where heat was a luxury, Fong considered these small balls a relief. He would no longer have to worry about the cold in his future. After numerous explosions and failures, he continued testing again and again. He only had to throw those black balls one by one into the container. Then came the turn of some seeds that he had acquired, and he decided to adopt a more relaxed posture, forcing himself to concentrate on his breathing. After several minutes of deep concentration, exhausted by the effort, he achieved the biggest breakthrough of his experiment. A huge broccoli suddenly appeared in his hand, just before his eyes closed, and he lost consciousness. He reflected that the success rate of this method was still too unpredictable, and at that moment, his body fell to the floor. Fortunately, he was already sitting on the tiles, so the impact was not so strong. Now he understood a little more about how the lights were activated. Who would have thought that the key to this strange ability was linked to his own consciousness? It was enough to enter a meditative state. His technique consisted of imagining himself in nature, free from the limitations of civilization. In other words, completely in his mental palace, with nothing more than his essential being. He would walk barefoot, feeling the earth under his feet, where life flourished. The sunlight caressed his skin, while everything around him harmonized. It was as if he was part of the natural world, a peaceful resonance of all life forms. Just like Adam in the Garden of Eden, upon reaching that mental state, he would slowly open his eyes, and a familiar green light would appear again. This ability was directly connected to his consciousness, activating through that link. Now he could invoke the green light at will. After having exhausted the plant samples, with a low success rate, it was time to test with another type of sample. On this occasion, he proposed to experiment with meats, so he slowly brought his right hand, surrounded by the green light, towards a juicy piece of meat. He already expected something, but it was disappointing to see that there was no reaction at all. Maybe the green light only worked with plants. Thinking that the soft approach was not enough, Fong squeezed the piece of meat tightly, and as he did, he prayed that his right hand would provoke some kind of change. After a few minutes of waiting, he had to accept that nothing would happen. Defeat and frustration were evident in his tired eyes. At that moment, he remembered the feeling he had experienced. While meditating, he had perceived two distinct colors, green and red, throughout the experiment. He had not tried to use the red light. Now he understood the key to activating his ability. He only had to focus on bringing that red light out of his consciousness. While holding the meat, he closed his eyes, focusing on the other ability that remained latent within him. After a while, a spark of red light appeared in his right hand. From that spark, the glow expanded rapidly, enveloping his hand and, surprisingly, also covering the meat. It was as if he was creating a bubbling reaction on the surface of the meat. After a few seconds of intense concentration, Feng opened his eyes and saw a viscous mass of dark red sludge that seemed to have emerged directly from a hellish place. When the red light immediately faded, he threw that repulsive thing to the floor, simply out of pure disgust. Realizing that this deformed sludge could provide valuable information, Feng crouched on the floor to observe it. He touched it, and it was a bit soft, so that's how meat would react to the red light. It might look disgusting, but the texture and overall sensation point to the possibility that the meat had been cooked, or something like that. Really, is that all the red light can do? Since stoves and pans could do the same and produce more appetizing meals than whatever. Feng refused to believe that was all. By using his consciousness to activate his abilities in a considerable amount, he could understand their capabilities at a deeper level. If he had to describe the feeling of the red light, it would be like a disintegration process. His next experiment with meat was much better than the first. But if that's the case, understanding the underlying concepts of these two lights could be easier than he had initially thought. He grabbed a handful of beans from his pile and squeezed them tightly in his right hand. In his left hand was the red light and the cooked meat. If the green light represents the evolution of matter, then the red light is the opposite, which would be disintegration. Given that he was already testing some confusing concepts, what would happen if he combined the green light grabbing beans and the red light grabbing meat? The result was an even bigger reaction than he expected. The combination produced a bright and blinding light between his hands. When the lights went out, it was revealed that his meat had grown much larger. The piece of meat had become enlarged. But where were the beans in his right hand? Could it be that the two subjects fused, producing this giant piece? Ben meticulously inspected the large piece of meat. No matter how you look at it, it's undeniably incredible. It looks, feels, and smells exactly like real meat, but somehow fresher. Gaining some confidence that he is getting better with this superpower thing, he decided to do more experiments. After a few hours, he was back at square one. Once again, his kitchen floor was filled with charred remains of meat. In frustrated crops, he threw a tantrum, and everything he tried failed miserably. After getting all that exasperation out of his system, Feng sat down and took a deep breath. He will pause the experiments for now. He can always take his time to understand its intricate details. Later on anyway, today was a productive day. Even though he ended it on a bitter and charred note, Feng can already see the future. If he manages to master this mysterious power, there is no doubt that with infinite resources, he would be the man who would be at the top of this world. Post-apocalyptic. It is his dream to be able to put some muscle on his image. Speaking of power, he may have forgotten one of the most important aspects of survival. Food alone will not be enough in the coming days. He will be completely vulnerable with all this loot if he doesn't have a decent weapon to defend himself. Quickly, he picked up the various crops scattered on the floor. He has to hurry and find a weapon before the temperature starts to drop drastically. Looking out the window, Feng realizes that the first signs of the apocalypse are already here. The snow begins to fall softly from the sky, marking the beginning of something bigger. Although people might think that it's just another snowy day, Feng knows that is not the case. Just like in the past, this is the beginning of the collapse of civilization as we know it. Stepping out into the open air, he feels the fear that temperatures could drop to 45 degrees below zero in just 1 week. He needs to get a weapon quickly, but in this country, the sale of weapons is illegal, and he has no connections with organized crime. That's when he heard a man shouting in an exaggerated way, bragging that he was a big construction businessman with millions invested in his projects. The man was talking to a passerby about his closeness with the fear loved one from the chain group, almost as if they were brothers. Feng recognizes this thug, a guy with a ridiculous fashion style, full of fake jewelry and exaggerated brand name clothing. This individual, who always offers cigarettes to everyone, is known in the area as Joe the Vagabond. Joe's real name is Lee, although he prefers to be called Brother Lee. He lives near where Fine is, and it is said that he is the one who manages the construction contracts in the neighborhood. Knowing everyone involved, if someone offers him cigarettes, he will not accept anything that is not a specific brand, since other brands make him cough. Although he doesn't have a steady job, he always gives the impression of being busy, walking back and forth while talking on the phone, discussing multi-million-dollar deals. As if he wanted everyone to know how successful he is, Feng sees him as a person with connections. and maybe that's the opportunity he needs. He decides to approach Joe, calling him Brother Lee, and telling him that it had been a while since they last saw each other. He smiles nervously, not knowing how the man will react. Joe, somewhat annoyed, asks him if they know each other, and as Fong approaches, he introduces himself, trying to sound familiar. He claims that they crossed paths a long time ago, although Lee seems to have forgotten. The thug complains about being overworked and having a bad memory, but agrees to chat. Fong is nervous because what he is about to ask is quite illegal. He makes sure that there is no one nearby who can hear what he is going to say. Cautiously, he approaches Lee and directly asks him for a weapon to defend himself, as he fears for his safety in the days ahead. Lee is startled and asks him why he would need a weapon, which makes Fong feel even more uncomfortable. However, he knows he has no other choice, so he insists. Lee, speaking seriously, clarifies that his organization is not involved in illegal activities, and that weapons are a very serious matter. He mentions that he has the necessary connections, but that he doesn't mix with common people to get weapons. Fong, sensing the tension, quickly shoves the Louis Vuitton bag he was carrying in his face and insists that there was a misunderstanding. He assures that he is only looking for weapons for self-defense, as he is involved in a dangerous feud. Then, he decides to make up a story to justify his request. According to Fong, one day while he was riding his bike to work, he came across an old man who was spitting everywhere on the bike path. It was so disgusting that, to top it off, one of those spits flew with the wind and ended up directly on his face when he just wanted to go unnoticed. Enraged by the disgusting old man, Fong threw his bike aside and confronted the old man. What did the damn man ask? He decided to spit on him again while he was venting his complaint. He couldn't take it anymore, and he applied some street justice to the disgusting old man. He gave him a good beating in the middle of the road. With everyone watching from the sidewalk, the old man left, with his clothes torn and his face a mess. The bastard swore that he would take revenge on Fong for this humiliation. The next day, the old man was already healed and waiting for Fong on the usual bike route. This time with some thugs. They gave Fong a pretty bad beating and threatened to do it again if they saw him anywhere again. His clothes were a mess. His face was full of bruises, and his body was hurt. He had never been so humiliated in his life. That's why he wants a weapon for self-defense. That's the long and short of the story. That's the story he was able to invent at the moment, and it seems it was quite effective. Brother Lee was furious with rage as he imagined the disgusting old man spitting in the street and hitting Fong. Such uncivilized behavior should not be tolerated. That's not really the point of Fang's story, but at least he's achieving something. Brother Lee patted him on the shoulder and assured him that he would take care of that vendetta. He assured Fong that his older brother would cover him. He only had to make a call, and they would get the weapon. Fong began to doubt if he had made the right decision. By approaching this guy with all that tough talk, Brother Lee invited him to go to the station and get on the bus with him. His excuse was that his Panamera was being repaired, so he couldn't drive to headquarters. Fong assured him that transportation would not be a problem, since he had his car parked right next door. After all, the new vehicle immediately caught the attention of this brand-obsessed vagabond. On the way to his older brother's house, Brother Lee kept talking about how Fong is living the good life and asked him how much the new car cost. It cost about 700,000 borrowed money, while he casually gave directions to turn left at the next intersection to get to the supposed office. Brother Lee kept taking pictures of himself sitting in the new leather seats. His social media username was Hot Guy, Handsome, and the post of the night was a photo of his goofy face with a caption complaining about how the seat of his SV was still too hard to sit on because it was new. They arrived in one of the dirtiest parts of the city. Some tough guys were camped outside, complaining about the bad weather. They couldn't be blamed since they went from summer to extreme winter. Overnight, seeing some shiny wheels parked, everyone turned to whoever was going to get out of the car. Seeing that it was Lee, they crowded towards him to ask what was going on. Brother Lee only told them that he had some errands to run with Boss Lee. The other thugs assumed the new car was Lee's and began to tease him about the price. Lee didn't deny it at all. He even boasted with pride that he had spent 700,000 on the car. Fong wasn't bothered, although hearing someone claiming to own the car with so much confidence, while the real owner is nearby, is a brazen move. As soon as they entered the establishment, the one known as Boss Lou, a gangster-looking man, came out annoyed that the loudmouth Lee had bothered him. So late at night, Brother Lee was visibly more reserved in front of the boss, even offering him cigarettes in a polite manner. However, the big guy had no time for such nonsense. He was a busy man. Brother Lee introduced his little brother, Fong, as a buyer of a weapon. Boss Lu observed Fong with a fixed gaze, as if he wanted to make sure he had heard correctly. As soon as the big boss took a look at him, Fong was petrified with fear. He didn't know what could happen if he said something wrong, or made the wrong move. Lu looked at him silently with a cigarette between his lips, studying him from head to toe. Finally, he gave a slight smile, although visibly disappointed that Fong only needed a cheap pistol, when he had expected something more impressive. Without saying a word, he gestured towards his trusted man called Chanchi, who already knew what he had to do. With agility, Chanchi pulled a pistol from his pocket and placed it on the table, while Boss Lu said a price of 1,000 for that compact and reliable pistol. Fong politely declined the offer, since in his mind he wanted something more powerful, something that was bigger and had greater range. He wasn't looking for a small pistol, but a rifle that he could use with a telescopic sight. Boss Lu frowned, his gaze intensifying as he watched him. Fong knew that perhaps he had crossed the line. The atmosphere became tense, and in silence he stayed, feeling that the words were not coming out. At that moment, Lu exploded in anger, wondering aloud how someone could ask for a sniper rifle, as if it were something easy to obtain. In his world, he was not running a gun store, but a private business, something much more serious. The offer was still the gun on the table. Take it or leave it. But it was Brother Lee who intervened, trying to calm the situation, to smooth things over. He invented a story that involved Fong, a lie about an event that happened 5 years ago, that involved Feng's wife, who did not actually exist. Lee, a compelling if somewhat talkative storyteller, told the story under the falling snow, while Boss Lo listened patiently until the end. The story was so elaborate that it managed to infuriate Boss Lu, who, red with rage, almost destroyed the table. He kept repeating, how disgusting were the people who had harmed Fong. According to Lee, Fong had a wife and children, but none of the children were actually his. At that moment, the protagonist remained silent, accepting everything that was said, even though the story was completely ridiculous, even for someone like me. The vagabond worked. Boss Lu, apparently touched by the story, guaranteed that Fong would get his sniper rifle. He assured that he himself would take care of getting it, although it might take a few days. He told him that the henchman Chang Si would take care of everything. Lu also suggested that Fong needed something semi-automatic, with enough ammunition so that he would be well prepared. Manoli definitely got it, and as if that were not enough, Boss Lu handed Fong the gun he had asked for, as a gift as a present between men. Fong was speechless, impressed by how the story had gotten the boss to establish a kind of bond with him. Now that everything was settled, Lu returned to focusing on his cell phone, attending to other important matters before leaving. Fong wanted to thank him in some way, mentioned that a friend of his who worked for the government had told him that there would soon be purchase restrictions due to the extreme weather, and that it would be better to stock up on supplies before the limits arrived. Seeing Feng's serious look, as if he really knew what he was saying, Boss Lu nodded and accepted the advice. Although it was not a subject that normally interested him, he decided to take it seriously. After a brief nod, Lu told him that he understood, and with that, Brother Lee and Fong left the underground center. With the weapon in hand, during the return trip, Lee kept bragging about how he had handled everything like a boss, highlighting that everything had gone perfectly. In fact, he even commented that if they wanted something even bigger, they could ask the boss, who would probably also approve it. Fong tried to return the favor by offering Lee cigarettes, but Brother Lee, with his typical modesty, insisted that he had only done what he could to help him. Still, he accepted Feng's offer, asking for between 7 or 8 cartons of his favorite cigarettes. He also promised to take him to a sauna as soon as he was paid for the project he claimed to be managing. Our guy was already thinking about his next logical move. The supplies were secured and the weapon acquired. At least, he would be ready for the first days of the apocalypse, and at least he could focus on studying his abilities. Solving the food problem would make his chances of surviving in the long term skyrocket. He was so absorbed in his own world while walking that he didn't notice an icy patch on the ground and slipped. Fong was so worried about surviving that he didn't follow one of the rules, most important for the upcoming ice age. Don't get hurt. He fell pretty badly, His leg must have absorbed the impact of the fall and was severely damaged. Brother Lee didn't know what to do as he ran towards his new friend. This is bad. Because of the sharp pain he felt and the awkward fall, there was a very real possibility that his leg was broken. Trembling, he pulled out his car keys and handed them to Brother Lee, asking to be taken to the nearest hospital as quickly as possible. Lee only scratched the back of his head and admitted that he doesn't actually have a driver's license, insisting that he can't drive without it. But it's safe to say that this vagabond simply can't drive. At least he didn't leave Fong lying on the floor, writhing in pain from a broken leg. He offered his shoulders to lift Fong, but he had a hard time doing it at this rate. Neither of them would make it to the hospital alive. So Fong called a taxi that he had to pay for. Since Lee is a penniless bum, even the hospital, an essential establishment, was beginning to freeze under the snowstorm that was intensifying. In the nursing office, someone named John was left in charge of the night shift. On that night of blizzards, the snow was falling harder, and the roads were beginning to be buried. The head nurse, named John, had just started her night shift, but the calls from the hallway were already starting to flood her, since the emergency section was severely understaffed. The pretty nurse had no choice but to get to work. After having an X-ray at the hospital, it was confirmed that he had actually broken his leg. The doctor explained that there was a stable fracture in his right tibia. That would be easy to set, but that he would need to stay for an hour in observation before going home with the medication. This accident couldn't have happened at a worse time. It just had to happen before the apocalypse started in full swing. While looking at the results of his X-ray, Fong regretted having been so reckless. Brother Lee accompanied him for most of the process, but the guy had to leave since he apparently had some business to attend to. However, he was a good guy and even left his number in case Fong needed anything else. Now that he was alone in the hospital lobby, Fong sighed deeply. He wondered how he could make such a stupid mistake at such a crucial moment. Looking at the chaos surrounding him was stressful. The hospital quickly filled with patients, victims of accidents caused by the sudden snowstorm and the rapidly falling temperatures. Emergency beds lined the corridors as a somber testament to the conditions getting worse outside. As for him personally, he just wanted to get his medication and get out of there as quickly as possible before the roads were completely closed. Fortunately, his waiting time would not be boring, since a goddess had just walked right in front of him. The head nurse had arrived to reinforce the emergency room that was understaffed. The first bed she checked had a patient with serious injuries. In her next round was bed 5, where a patient's wounds had just been cleaned. Fortunately, the vital signs were stable. Bed 5 only needed another dose of glucose. In 10 minutes, she advised the nurse in charge that if the patient's heart rate dropped below 80, epinephrine should be administered immediately. During the rounds, the head nurse Fong couldn't take his eyes off her. She was simply impressive. Being a head nurse at such a young age must have been a generational talent. He also saw how she handled all kinds of patients. She was kind and incredibly skilled. She seemed like a radiant being in the midst of a desperate place. Besides, she was incredibly beautiful. She was working the busy night shift, but her smile never faded. She was basically an angel. Suddenly, the old man sitting next to him began to call out to the beautiful head nurse. She wasn't really required to attend to patients outside of her rounds, but still, she answered the call with a smile. The head nurse, John, apologized politely to the old man and asked him if she could come back later to help, since she still needed to provide urgent care to some patients to cover the staff shortages. The old man complained that his back was hurting too much. He explained that the pain in his back had gotten worse lately, and he wanted the head nurse to check it out to see what was causing it. In reality, this old man was just a shameless pervert trying to record under her skirt. Unaware of what was really happening, John just smiled and apologized again, saying that for back problems like that, it would be necessary to schedule an X-ray. To be sure, the shameless one began to insist, asking her to just take a quick look while pointing at the area where it hurt. The guy even got up from his seat to touch the angelic nurse. Inappropriately, being the head in the clouds that she used to be, John laughed since she was naturally ticklish. For back problems, the most recommended thing is to wait for the resident doctor's examination. The shameless one kept insisting, his hand lowering more and more from her waist. A damn flying crutch crashed into the shameless old man, giving him real pain in the back and throwing the phone out of his hands. always kind. Jean wanted to check if the old man was okay. Foam came to her rescue, humbly apologizing for his flying crutch. Since it was the first time he had used one, he crouched and went directly to the old pervert's phone, without shame, while brazenly questioning whether it was broken or not. Just when he was about to touch it, the shameless one started sweating nervously and shouting at him to stay away from the phone. Phone didn't listen to him. He walked to the side of the room, getting rid of his bandage, and he wasn't going to let that disgusting pervert get away with it for doing something so disgusting. As soon as he opened the phone, his suspicions were confirmed. He looked the pervert directly in the eyes. If looks could kill, the old man would have died at that moment. The proof was on the home screen. That shameless one had had the audacity to record under the skirt of a hard-working nurse and even assault her. There was no reason for Foam not to call security and have them escort the guy to a jail cell where criminals love to put perverts in their place. Foam stayed with the phone, and as soon as he had the opportunity to face that repugnant old man again, that disgusting old man threatened to completely ruin him, his miserable existence. He barely could, got up from the hospital floor and ran, as if his life depended on it. Meanwhile, Nurse Jin was bewildered, seeing how someone who was complaining of such intense back pain could move at such speed. Foam, for his part, couldn't help but be surprised to see how this naive man didn't seem to realize the situation. He decided to show him what the old man was doing, with the phone recording under the nurse's skirt. After seeing his reaction, he didn't seem to have noticed anything strange. Foam handed him the phone with the recordings, letting him decide whether to delete it or take it to the police. He also took the opportunity to remind him to be more careful, to prevent people like that man from taking advantage of his kindness. She responded with a radiant smile, as if she were shining with 1,000 stars, and then asked if his legs still hurt. The adrenaline from having caught the shameless man had probably numbed the pain in his broken leg, but now that everything was resolved, the pain returned strongly, and he couldn't help but scream in pain. Fortunately, Jin was an expert in that type of injury, and quickly put the cast back on. She looked at him and asked if the pain persisted. Fong thanked her for her help and told her that he didn't feel anything anymore. At that moment, the room full of people seemed empty, as if only the two of them existed in the space. Jian appreciated the gesture and promised him that she wouldn't let people like that get away with it. While Fong was lost in his thoughts, another nurse called Jian, since her help was urgent in the emergency beds. Before leaving, the head nurse reminded him that he should return in a week for a checkup on his leg. Fong promised to do so, although he knew that planning something so far in advance was unrealistic. He just smiled with resignation because he understood how things really worked in this world. He took the crutch with which he had hit the old man and left the hospital, knowing that he would never see her again. The next day, the snowstorm continued relentlessly and had even worsened. The snow had covered all infrastructure and services, making going outside extremely dangerous. In the morning news, emergency weather reports continued, warning that in the next 24 hours, heavy snowfalls were expected and a drastic drop in temperatures throughout the country. Strange international reports indicated that temperatures were dropping drastically in places that should never experience snow. Dubai, Egypt, the Amazon basin, among others. News channels repeated over and over that experts claimed that this severe cold front wouldn't last long. Each report ended with a public service message urging the population to follow government warnings, to remain calm and avoid falling for unfounded rumors or hoarding unnecessary supplies, as the disaster would soon pass. Warm, cozy, and drinking wine inside his fully equipped house, Foam clicked his tongue. The government and media were still blatantly lying, feeding the public nonsense to maintain order. If he hadn't died and come back to life, he might even have believed them. But this time it was different. He was well prepared for everything that was to come. Supplies were fully stocked. The house was reinforced, and the heating system was working perfectly. He had been so well prepared that there was nothing to worry about in the immediate future. His phone started vibrating incessantly with messages from the group chat of the residents of the housing complex, discussing the strange weather and how the snow was already making the roads impassable. Everyone was clearly bewildered about what was happening. but not the member nicknamed Mystery Person. Whoever that was demanded everyone's attention to inform them that the snowstorm was not caused by normal weather patterns, but by something within the earth itself. The Mystery Person proclaimed that everyone should pay attention to their words. Since the age apocalypse of ice was about to begin, no one was more surprised to read those messages than Fong. Who the hell is this Mystery Person? And how do they know something about the apocalypse? After seeing the enigmatic messages from the Mystery Person in the housing complex group chat, Fong mentally noted to keep an eye on this type. Meanwhile, the rest of the residents were complaining and demanding that the property management team do something about the snow accumulation. Most of them were already starting to run out of supplies and feared that the supermarkets would empty out. At this moment, the group chat of the residents of the housing complex, Happy was like an amusement park that depended on a very delicate balance. Most of the tenants were pressuring the property agents to go outside and give them an explanation of why they couldn't restock essential products due to the inaccessibility of the roads. The property management team wasn't even at fault here, but they were still apologizing for not being able to take action due to the uncontrolled disaster. An admission of incapacity made the tenants even more aggressive, thinking the management was useless. They demanded that the team return their fees. Fong was in the middle of this heated discussion. He knew it was a completely futile fight, since the snowstorm was not something that humans could deal with. Fortunately, another person stood out from the crowd. His voice to stop the fight cut through the noisy chaos. It was the owner of the unit, 61124, who wore glasses, explained that with the snowstorm being so strong, clearing it would be useless, since it would accumulate again after a few hours. So instead of fighting, maybe everyone could help clear it. If they had done that instead of arguing, they would have already been able to go out long ago. He added that the property management team were only human. They were also helpless in the face of an anomalous natural disaster. He asked the tenants if they were just looking for someone to unload their frustration. The angry mob immediately turned against him for scolding them about decency. They even accused the guy with the glasses of being one of the useless members of the property management team. The guy with the glasses clarified that he was not speaking on behalf of the management team. He was just speaking objectively and realistically. Pushing the management against the wall would be useless and would only prolong the problem. It wouldn't give them the result they all wanted. Now that he said it that way, people turned to the guy with the glasses for the next step. He explained that given the current conditions, it would be impossible to drive to the supermarket. Even if they cleared the snow from the neighborhood, the main outer roads might still be impassable. He suggested then clearing a path for pedestrians to walk to get supplies there. Fong didn't know what to think, but something in the attitude of this guy, called Hank, seemed familiar to him, as if he had met him in his previous life. He was someone very lively, and his charisma was noticeable even in the group chat. Some tenants agreed with Hank's proposal, thinking that it wasn't worth complicating their lives. Those who wanted to go out should take care of cleaning the path. Those who didn't better stay quiet. The immature discussion for hours, just for something as trivial as snow. It was finally tiring when everyone realized how ridiculous the situation was. The chat soon calmed down. Another member of the group offered to clear the path, said he needed to go out to see his brother and close a multi-million business deal. Although Fong had not heard his voice or seen his profile picture, something about his way of speaking reminded him of a gangster. He knew barely the first volunteer offered. More people started to join, since most were starting to run out of supplies. Even an impressive young woman dared to face the storm, despite not being as strong as the rest. As for Juina, claimed that she had been sick with the flu for the last 2 days, but still wanted to help clean up the neighborhood. Peng was not impressed and suspected her innocent attitude was just a facade. Most of the men in the neighborhood knew her well and were dying to do her favors. Some of them immediately offered to help her. When a group of her followers joined, she thanked them for the help and asked them to clear the way for pedestrians. Tired of all this, Fong left the chat, but he had to admit that Juina really knew how to manipulate men with just a few touches. She got them to do whatever she wanted. As for him, he was using a more direct approach, insisting that they talk. And deep down, he just wanted her to bring him something from the supermarket. She was an expert in her game, Her message was accompanied by a flirty photo from her bed, in which she even showed a little more than necessary, seeking to attract the shameless. Fong couldn't help but be impressed by her audacity. Despite the extreme weather conditions, she was still trying to seduce him with her minimalist outfit. She really had the power to transform any man. With that kind of attitudes, now came the most interesting part. Fong could respond as he pleased, but whatever he had sent her seemed to have bothered her a lot. As soon as she saw his response, Juina threw her phone to the ground and crushed it furiously. Fong spent time watching videos and browsing on TikTok. On his profile, he seemed to be a very cultured man, although it had only been a few days. He was already starting to get bored of being home all the time. It seemed that his biggest challenge in this apocalypse would be dealing with loneliness. And to make matters worse, his broken leg needed at least months to fully heal. Feng's boredom always led him to watch videos. On the internet, he came across a macabre broadcast in a science column about a man who suffered a brutal accident. After doctors sewed up the man, who jumped from the 15th floor, they discovered that his damaged internal organs and bones began to regenerate. This sensational news gave Feng an idea, one he really should have thought of much earlier. Why not? Had he thought of using his newly acquired powers on himself, he activated the green light on his right hand and carefully touched his leg. Broken with it, after a few seconds in which nothing happened, the green light began to dissipate. Feng refused to believe it was a failure, so he tried again. He activated the green light more forcefully than before, but just like before, the light eventually went out, without any change in his leg. It seemed he was thinking too much. He really thought that the green light could help his injury recover faster, but it seemed that all it was causing was an irresistible sleep. Feng finally succumbed to the weight of his eyes and took a nap on the couch. He woke up to a strange ceremony that involved goats and headdresses. Native American, under the transcendent light of the night sky, Feng was riding on the backs of giant goats with a bloody whip in his hands. Goat heads flew next to him. In this strange ceremony, Feng is riding at the front of a herd of goats over a field of bloody red grass. There are totems scattered around the land, and he amuses himself by whipping his whip everywhere. Well, that fun only lasts a minute before he is pulled off the goat and thrown into the herd. He eventually lands on the red grass field and falls badly. His foot is at an awkward angle, and there is a crackling sound that makes him wince in pain. Going from the absolute freedom of riding goats in the field to being motionless on the ground is quite shocking. To make matters worse, one of the goats begins to lick his broken leg. Feng, disgusted, tries with all his might to drive the goat away from his unfortunate wound. He pushes the goat again and again until the animal finally reacts. It extends its tongue like a frog, wrapping that viscous piece around his affected leg. Then the goat raises its head, and Feng's body moves with it helplessly, while he feels the viscous saliva going down his leg. He also begins to feel the warmth of the green light enveloping his wound. Feng finally wakes up from that strange nightmare that involves many goats. He is sweating and screaming. The dream is too immersive. As he struggles to catch his breath, he wonders what caused that messy dream. Well, the answer presents itself quite clearly. His broken leg still has some green light around it. In addition, Feng feels a certain lightness in his limbs. Immediately, he removes the bandage that was wrapped around his wound and throws it to the side. Feng, excited, steps on the ground and carefully puts more weight on his right leg. He is pleased and surprised to confirm that the injury no longer hurts. He is completely healed. For some reason, this should mean that the green light could also help with self-recovery. But could the healing process only occur while sleeping? There is only one way to find out, and that is to try again on a localized part of the body. With trembling hands,
he takes the sharpest knife he has in the kitchen and slowly places it against
his other hand, filling with determination. Feng can't even watch as the blade touches. His skin, a small prick would be enough, but the wound on the tip of his finger lets the blood flow easily without losing an instant with the bleeding. Feng summons a green light that does its healing work. Seeing how it heals, quickly a smile appears on his face. Now it's clear to him he has a real advantage for survival in his hands. Outside the building, the volunteers who are in charge of clearing the path work together, striving for the good of the community. the man with the glasses, thanks everyone for their effort in this arduous task. He even takes a moment to highlight the oldest of the group, Uncle Lou, and apologize for any inconvenience. Feng always knows what words to say at every moment. Uncle Lou just laughs and assures that he hasn't done much, since those who really gave themselves to the work were the Jin brothers. Those two, Jin Shin Win and Jin Shin Woo, were really committed to the cleaning, showing great dedication. While they finish cleaning the last details, a young woman wearing a pink coat slips on the ice. The Jin brothers run towards her to make sure she's okay and remind her to be more careful. The young woman named Jingon is active and energetic, very different from Leuna, who pretended to be sick and didn't even leave her room. The Jin brothers have a lot to do, so they just remind Jingon to let them know if she needs help. She assures them that she will be fine. The snow starts to fall more heavily, so those who have plans to go shopping should hurry. Speaking of supplies, Uncle Lou remembers something he had noticed a few weeks ago. Pausing a moment, doubts to share it, but curious Feng encourages him to speak. The old man has heard that in the last few days, a neighbor has been bringing supplies in a small truck, as if he was moving. Hank thinks this is something usual, since there are always people moving or renovating their houses. However, Uncle Lou notes something strange in this case. He observed that the neighbor was transporting gas tanks and a complete fireplace, which is not common in a move. Although it's just a hunch, Uncle Lou believes that person might be preparing for a particularly harsh winter. Their conversation is interrupted when the Jin brothers finish clearing the main path. People will now be able to go out. Uncle Lou thanks everyone for their effort, but without anyone knowing, another resident has been listening. Upon hearing talk about winter preparations, his curiosity is aroused. This individual is quickly silenced by a snowball thrown by the young woman Li. The man tries to defend himself, arguing that he has been working alone all the time and that she was just watching, but Lian dismisses him as if he were a naughty child. Feng intervenes to put an end to the dispute and informs them that the main path is now clear and ready to use. This means that the volunteers can stop working and prepare to go to the supermarket in search of supplies. When reviewing their shopping list, it seems that the Jin brothers have a lot to acquire, even thinking of buying something for their mother, as they believe she will need it. Uncle Lou, who before did not want to share details, now shows a great interest in Zhang's opinion on that neighbor who has been bringing large amounts of supplies. Speaking truthfully, Feng doesn't feel too worried about the rumors, as he still believes what the government and authorities say, that this is just a brief snowstorm that will stop very soon. They just need to hold on a little, and then they can return to normal. So, he is not too worried about those mysterious deliveries. But even if they back down, and suppose that this snowstorm has come to stay, if someone in the neighborhood is hoarding a large reserve of resources, wouldn't that be a good thing for everyone? Uncle Lou immediately understands what Feng is implying and praises the young man for being astute. Under the relentless snowfall, with no signs of stopping, Feng guides some of the tenants to the supermarket. He makes sure everyone is lining up properly. With the snow getting heavier, they must try to return in 3 hours. If they exceed 3 hours, who knows if they will even have a path to return by, while those brave souls enter the unknown and endure the hostile environment. Feng has fallen, passed out in his warm and cozy living room. Drooling on himself, he would have fallen asleep on this couch forever, surrounded by sodas and junk food, to cope with the boring day, if it wasn't for the annoying voice calling at the door. Feng opens the door lazily, wipes the sleep from his eyes, and sees the beggar Joe. Brotherly well. The skillful and persuasive gangster has made his appearance again. Hidden in a large bag, there is a semi-automatic rifle complete with a proper sight. Just what Feng wanted. This was the gift promised by Boss Lou. Brotherly had agreed to bring it, because he had accumulated supplies beforehand, and now he could afford not to run around the city like crazy, looking for supplies, like most other citizens. But still, Feng was grateful to him for showing up this way. In addition, Brother Lee had very interesting information. Several rumors had already started spreading about what had happened. The night before, an unknown person had emptied the shelves of a supermarket in the East District, and when Boss Lou's gang cleared their way out of the snow yesterday, They found nothing but emptiness in the supermarket. For Feng, something like this seemed unbelievable. To completely empty a huge supermarket in a single night. Who could be capable of doing something like that? For a moment, his thoughts were interrupted by Brother Lee, who advised Feng to put on warmer clothes and be careful. After that, he said goodbye and left. Finally, our hero could be alone and think about all this. He kept trying to think of a logical explanation for what had happened the night before. How could someone empty a supermarket in a single night? The only explanation he could come up with was the theory that it could have been someone with superpowers, like in novels and comics. Someone able to hide unlimited amounts of supplies in his own subspace. The only question was, could people exist with such abilities in this world? And the answer to that question was quite simple. Since he himself had superpowers, someone else could have them too. This was a disturbing discovery. Now Feng couldn't waste a moment. He needed to examine his superpowers further so that when he encountered other superpower holders, he had his own strategy to counter them. He simply had to know their strengths and weaknesses, as well as the limit of his superpowers. To do this, he opened his journal and began to study the facts already known about his powers. At this point, he already knew that his power could react with different foods, both vegetables and animals. With their help, he could make them grow quickly, increase their volume, and even fry them, although with a horrible taste. But still, for example, for soybeans, the probability of a plant growing was 10%. For meat, even less. Feng kept failing and understanding why things worked the way they did. Suddenly, the soybean, under the influence of force, exploded in his hand, releasing a nasty green cloud. And instead of a normal plant, our hero had a rock in his hand. This was starting to bother him. The failure rate was too high. Feng had to learn to use his power more effectively, and he was determined to start practicing intensely. For this, he spared no time and worked hard until late at night. And finally he succeeded. Feng held in his hands a fresh live soybean plant, with its pod still intact. It was not a simple task to get there. He was soaked in sweat, and his apartment had become a kind of sauna. But this was the price he had to pay, to discover some rules that increased the probability of success in his experiment. During his research, he understood that the energy of the green light was not constant, and that depending on the type of product, it was crucial to apply this light for specific periods, according to the nutritional value of what he was processing. If he didn't hit the exact duration, the result would be a disaster, a burned object with a bad smell. That is, he needed to find the perfect time interval for each type of product. This reminded him of a popular music and dance game that had been very famous a few years ago. In that game, the correct buttons had to be pressed at the right rhythm and at the precise moment. He thought that the energy was like the directions up, down, left, right, and that the energy input had to match the exact moment. In the end, he had to identify the critical point and stop at the right instant. If he did it correctly, he would succeed, and each soybean would become a plant. After achieving it with the plants, Feng decided to try with the meat. But working with meat was very different from vegetables. If he made the slightest error in the process, the meat was transformed into a disgusting black mush. Despite that the principles remained the same, the first thing was to calculate how much energy the meat needed. Everything seemed to work as planned, but a problem arose. The chicken leg exploded just like the previous ones, turning into that repulsive black mass. It seemed that it would cost him much more to learn how to work with meat than with vegetables. After numerous failed attempts, the chicken legs burst one after another, and there seemed to be no end to his failure. Finally, Feng felt desperate. He even shouted, cursing how difficult everything was. But despite the frustration, he was not one to give up. While the snow fell harder outside his window and the temperature dropped, Feng kept trying. His kitchen was full of traces of his effort, and the crucial moment arrived. The last chicken leg, he was almost doing it automatically, without even expecting success. Up, down, left, right, red energy, green energy. He felt that everything was a game of mini-games, excessively complicated. He repeated the process again, and if he made a mistake, he had to start again. The tension was at its peak, but this time Feng did it. He made the chicken leg grow to an impressive size, with a sigh of satisfaction. He said it was worth it and let himself fall exhausted but happy. On the floor, He had finally discovered how to synthesize meat. The days passed, and the weather worsened. The news reported that July 17th was the third consecutive day of catastrophic snowfall that was hitting the whole country. This disaster seemed to be an event that only occurred once every several thousand years. The authorities were working in a hurry to mitigate the consequences and support the affected population. This was how Phone woke up the next day, listening to the same old warnings. The snow has paralyzed transport, electricity, and the internet. But everything will be solved soon. You just have to wait a little longer, the report said. Aid supplies would arrive soon to the most affected areas. In the end, the presenter recommended everyone stay home and avoid going out unnecessarily. For Phone, there was nothing new in all that, since he had already heard it in his past life. Suddenly, a notification arrived on his phone, followed instantly by several more. Phone immediately saw that it was a group of residents from his building who had started making noise again, and he just couldn't help joining the discussion. The noise around was incredible. Everyone was discussing the morning news. Some believed that the rescuers would arrive to help them. Others thought it was all empty promises and made plans to save themselves. Only one avatar stood out from the crowd and asked the credulous if they really believed what was being said on the news. It was old Uncle Lou, and absolutely, he did not believe what was being said on television. If everything was under the government's control, the rescue teams would have already arrived a long time ago. Instead, he had heard rumors from old friends that the government was assembling armored vehicles, tanks, and other heavy weapons in the city, to the capital of the country. They were probably preparing for war that was about to break out. After hearing the very real possibility of an all-out war against an unknown enemy, a shiver went through the group chat full of paranoid survivors. Then came the eruption of worries, asking Uncle Lou if what he was saying was true. Meanwhile, Phone was just fascinated by the emergence of the topic of war. He had heard something about this progression in his previous life. Mr. Zhang intervened to silence all the noise. He stated that if what Uncle Lou was saying was true, then they had to start taking survival measures to save everyone. Some owners in the neighborhood had already run out of supplies, and with the government's support resources still uncertain, he proposed to organize those who were facing difficulties. He passionately suggested that those with ample supplies donate some of their reserve. To serve as an example, Mr. John pledged to donate half of his supplies to anyone who needed it. Other owners quickly discussed what was being proposed. In a low voice, a man fully agreed with Mr. Zhang's proposal. Since everyone was just trying to overcome the crisis, he pledged to donate whatever he could, and even involved Juina. She knew this madman called Bubu. That man was trying to humiliate her in front of everyone, just because she had rejected him before. So Juina had to defend herself, showing her submissive girl persona while apologizing, since she had no extra supplies left. Most of the followers immediately jumped to defend the witch, which caused a small chaos that almost ruined the organization plan. It was almost impossible to gather people to collaborate selflessly, but finally donations began to arrive. Surely many people felt touched by Mr. Zhang's emotional speech. Food, clothes, medicines, all the basic needs were contributed. Mr. Zhang sincerely thanked those who offered their help. Since there were too many people to coordinate, he thought the most sensible thing would be to appoint some leaders to manage everything, and he himself would be at the forefront. So he formed a provisional committee in charge of organizing and distributing the donated resources. Phone couldn't help but smile when reading the announcement. These types of provisional committees also existed in his previous life, and soon he would realize that everything was part of a plan to seize other people's resources. It was July 19th, the 5th day of the apocalypse. The outside temperatures had already fallen to minus 40 degrees Celsius. Finally came the moment when the building's central heating system shut down due to the intense cold. Everyone was desperately looking for ways to stay warm. Without the heaters, some managed to light small fires inside their homes, just like in the previous timeline. The situation was horrible, and everything indicated that it would continue to worsen. But of course the exception was Phone. He had everything ready. His experimental failed charcoal, which was ideal for fueling his fireplace. On the table rested a cola ice pop and a delicious slice of strawberry cake. Meanwhile, Fong was doing what anyone would do in his situation, playing single-player video games, completely oblivious to the chaos outside. But his tranquility would soon be interrupted by an unexpected call. He paused the game and answered, while drinking his soda. On the other end of the line, the person in charge of Block 8 informed him that, in 20 minutes, they would begin to clear the paths, and they needed help in the underground parking lot. Fong resisted the urge to curse the guy. They still didn't understand that the snow would keep accumulating. However, despite his frustration, he decided to leave the comfort of his home and go down to the lobby. He didn't want to get complicated fighting with the neighbors, so he set out to keep his secret intact. After all, the snow had already trapped them in the building. The volunteers who were already there were annoyed because the snow had covered the cleared paths. Previously, they decided to try to open the door, and upon seeing it, they called Fong to help them open the entrance. Together, they put all their weight on the door and counted to 3. To their surprise, as it opened, an avalanche of snow flooded the lobby, leaving them exposed to the fury of a snowstorm. Unstoppable, the storm was so brutal that they couldn't even withstand the cold. Getting close to the outside was so dangerous that opening their eyes could cause them injury. Fong regretted having abandoned his warm couch to get involved in such painful work. If someone went out in that weather, death would not be such an outlandish option. Luckily, the other volunteers also reached the same conclusion. Only a fool would try to go out in those conditions. And speaking of fools, finally arrived. A familiar voice to Fong echoed. It was the Vagabond Joe, or better known as Brother Lee. He was scolding everyone for being cowards, telling them they should be braver. At times like this, the volunteers were shivering from the cold, while trying to convince Brother Lee of how absurd it would be to try to go out in such a fierce snowstorm. However, Brother Lee was different. First, he finished the cigarette he was smoking in one go, ready to enter like the madman he was. Brother Lee made his way through the snow that trapped everyone with his hands. The fool began to scream like an anime character, while literally beating the snow, scattering the pile everywhere. He continued doing this for a while, and even managed to make a hole, the size of Vagabond Joe, in the middle of the human snow pile. After a few moments, all the volunteers could hear were distorted pleas, asking for help from under the pile of snow. The others had to pull Vagabond Joe out of the snow. His face was purple from the cold, and from being trapped under the heavy snow. Finally, the volunteers decided that venturing outside was impossible, and closed the door. Fong ran towards Brother Lee, trying to make sure that the stupid gangster was okay. He asked everyone to go to the parking lot first, so that they could look for the person in charge of assistance. With such a snowstorm raging all over the world, people were no longer in a situation where the problem could be solved with manpower. In the building's underground parking lot, it seemed that the atmosphere was a bit more comfortable since it was underground. Mr. Zhang, the leader of the defense, was surrounded by the owners as always. Upon receiving reports from the lobby, he agreed that the clearing operation should take a break. In addition, from now on, the underground parking lot would be the designated point for donations and collections. Fong remained in the background. It was the first time he met that guy, with the last name Zhang from the group chat. This meant that this was the guy who had spearheaded the creation of that eventual committee. Fraudulent. With his kind attitude and polite way of speaking, Mr. Zhang would manipulate everyone with courtesy and the illusion of support and unity. Mr. Zhang commented on the overwhelming rain of donations from so many owners. Those generous donations would help those who were struggling, and for that he was grateful. The general atmosphere in the parking lot was quite positive. People felt good about their selfless acts. It gave them a false sense of unity as they worked on the same goal of survival. However, Fong knew something they didn't. They just had to wait and see. As the disaster continued eternally, they would soon regret having handed over their resources. Brother Lee, still shaking from the move he tried to make before, decided to leave first and say goodbye to Fong. Looking around the parking lot, Fong noticed someone eye-catching. It was that clueless nurse he had met at the hospital when he broke his leg. She was wearing a cute kind of winter jumpsuit, while clumsily carrying a stack of boxes. She was clearly struggling to make her way through the crowd of people that surrounded the committee. Finally, she collided with some of the guys who were standing around. She would have fallen to the floor if it hadn't been for Fong, who came to the rescue once again. while holding her along with her box. He asked if the blushing nurse was okay. When she finally opened her eyes, she expressed her gratitude for the rescue and finally recognized Fong from the hospital. Then she remembered that his leg was supposed to be seriously injured. He shouldn't be in a condition to catch maidens who were falling. Realizing that she had acted impulsively without thinking about the situation, Fong struggled to find a convincing way out. He stammered a little before coming out. With that, he had always had an excellent ability to recover. From a young age, however, his nervous gestures made his explanation sound unbelievable. Fortunately, the nurse didn't seem to grasp anything strange in his attitude, since she was simply impressed by how quickly he recovered. Fong wanted to be helpful, offered his help to carry some boxes. She initially refused the offer, claiming they were too heavy, but he insisted. After a little persuasion, she agreed to hand over the boxes. As soon as he lifted them, he was surprised by how heavy they really were. They were incredibly loaded. Curious, he asked her what was inside. She told him that it was mainly medical supplies that she was donating to those in need. She also mentioned that maybe she had been a little excessive with the weight, but there was no problem in delivering them to the donation point. Fong, completely enchanted by her beauty and kindness, would have been willing to carry a few more kilos without complaint, especially when she told him that he was stronger than most guys. The nurse kindly reminded him that he shouldn't push himself too hard. When she asked him if he had always been so strong, she was somewhat reserved and explained that there was a reason behind it. Intrigued by her words, Fong wanted to know more, but she seemed uncomfortable talking about it and apologized for mentioning it. She commented that something had happened recently that she couldn't explain. While they continued walking and talking, she realized that she didn't know his name yet. Fong introduced himself politely, and she, with a big smile, said her name was Gino. Her smile was so bright that Fong couldn't help but admire her. At that moment, Fong was completely speechless, but Nurse Jinu snapped him out of his reverie by asking him what he did. In a sincere way, he replied that he was unemployed. Just when they were close to reaching their destination, something interrupted the moment. A man rushed past them and pushed Nurse Jinu, who lost her balance and ended up falling on Fong. He instinctively was the only one who could hold her to prevent her from falling completely. This caused the nurse's body to press against Feng's arm, leaving him momentarily paralyzed. Jinu quickly pulled away, apologizing while Fong tried to reassure her, telling her that there was no problem. What would have been a perfect date was interrupted by the appearance of Juina the witch, with a tired and disheveled face. She approached as if she were in a trance. She immediately approached Fong and, taking him somewhat possessively, asked who the pink-haired woman was and if she was a friend of his. This made Nurse Jinu uncomfortable, who quickly took the boxes from Fong and apologized for interrupting. Her intention was simply to deliver the donations and not to interrupt the conversation between the two. Fong, somewhat confused, asked Juina what she was doing down there. The witch explained that she had gone to collect some supplies and added that she was worried about him because she had seen him so inactive. Fong scratched his head and told her that he was about to send a message. Juina called him a liar, pointing out that at that moment he was conversing with another woman, which seemed somewhat contradictory. Then began the questions about food. Juina commented that she had almost no food at home and asked if she could share some of his. He didn't get angry or anything like that. On the contrary, he smiled, continuing with his simp act. Fong said that he didn't have much food left either, but he could share some, but he would only share with people who responded to messages. Acting confidently, he took the witch by the waist and asked her if she would be willing to accompany him to his house for a few days. Not used to this version, more confident of her supposed simp, the witch lost her composure for a second, pushed him away, and smiled. Juina insisted that if Fong wanted to talk, they could do it online. Taking this as a direct rejection, Fong decided to return to his house. Being in a desperate situation, the witch stopped him before he could go too far, telling him to wait. She assured that he had changed quite a bit lately. She also stated that she had always been very serious with her feelings, with the most convincing puppy eyes she could make. Juina professed that she didn't want people to think that she was only with Fong for his money, so she would need a little more time for something more serious. Fong looked at her as she blushed. Fortunately, he controlled himself immediately. If he hadn't already died once at her hands, he would have believed those words. But at that moment, he just wanted to tear off her ugly mask. The thing is that he hadn't discovered who was yet the man behind the witch. Thinking about it now, why would he look for the guy when he could just act and proceed, as he did in his previous life, until Juina brought the man naturally. This time, he would be more prepared. Sure, they have a steel bat, but Feng has a sniper rifle. Realizing this, he decided not to alter things too much and joked, saying that he was just kidding her. The witch felt a little embarrassed for putting on another masterclass of acting. For a joke, still Feng stated that he would wait for her message to be able to deliver some food supplies. The next day, with this they finally said goodbye. She even told him to call her if he wanted to talk about anything. When the witch left the parking lot, a malicious smile appeared at the corners of his mouth. Bill, without her knowing. This time Feng was not the one being manipulated. He really enjoyed tormenting her discreetly. 2 days passed without Feng contacting the witch. This turned into Juina, overflowing his phone with text messages, angry about the delivery of the promised supplies. Feng only let all the salty messages accumulate while eating a hot meal of steak with a soda. Finally, upon discovering the method for making meat deliciously delicious, this was a game changer. The cold weather outside was perfect for enjoying hot food inside. While everyone was miserable in the cold, this guy was comfortably sweating in his bathrobe. He hadn't been just resting these last few days. He performed numerous experiments that allowed him to confirm two important things. First, his meat could not expand indefinitely. Second, just like soy meat could reproduce without limit, his experiments had already produced pounds and pounds of meat. For each full stalk of beans that sprouted, he used half to grow more beans and ate the other half. He could freely apply the same principle to meat under the red and green light. Half a steak and a handful of soybeans could produce a whole steak. Exploiting the same process again and again, he could produce an unlimited amount of steaks. After conducting numerous tests to test this hypothesis, he concluded that he would not have to worry about eating good food. In the future, television stations continued to send their reporters to cover the unprecedented snowstorm that was reaching its 19th day. It was already August 2nd, and places as distant as the Maldives Islands, near the equator, had recorded temperatures of minus 42 degrees Celsius. The entire island was covered in ice and snow, and the sea was beginning to freeze rapidly. Visible to the naked eye, the situation was so unreal that even the experts claimed that the ice sheet had reached 55 centimeters thick. Other countries near the equator, known for their warm climate, suffered the same phenomenon. Feng observed all this from his huge entertainment center and mocked what the media was showing. He knew that the reality outside his home was much worse than the news wanted to make believe. While enjoying his daily red wine, a loud noise from outside startled him. He quickly approached the window and opened the curtains. In the distance, he could see a building engulfed in flames. This was the 7th fire in a few days. Although it was not clear what had caused it, he was sure that it was not a good sign. In addition, military helicopters were flying over the city more and more. If he didn't know what was happening, probably the other survivors didn't either. Panic had gripped the residents, who now congregated near the underground parking lot, exchanging goods and food. Human greed had left its mark, and many took advantage of others, which caused constant fights. In the midst of all this was Mr. Hank, who posed as the reliable leader, who provided resources to those most in need without charging anything in return. That day, Feng decided to go down to the parking lot with the other survivors. He had only left his house for a few minutes and already felt the cold, which made him regret more and more leaving the comfort of his home. The real reason he went down was to get useful information. If it wasn't for that, he would never have shown his face to these people again. Before he could start investigating, he remembered that there was a rebellion spreading in the neighborhood. If his memory didn't betray him, this rebellion was related to the people in the basement where he was now. Those who still maintained the promise to distribute resources. Instead of scamming people, Feng decided to do some detective work. In the midst of that chaos, observing the long lines to pick up supplies, it seemed that many families were struggling against the shortages. At the front, a man was complaining of the small amount of resources he had received. despite having donated several boxes of supplies, while Mr. Jang was trying to convince him that everyone would receive a fair share. The man with a can and a sausage in hand demanded that his donations be returned. However, the committee could not do that, since the disaster was still happening. Mr. Jang asked him to consider the overall situation and promised to return the money once everything calmed down. But a promise of money in an uncertain future meant nothing at that moment. Soon others in line began to criticize the man for his attitude, asking him to stop complaining and move on. The crowd quickly formed around this idea. Influenced by the provisional committee, Fong knew that there was no way that those in charge would deliver resources at this moment. However, taking advantage of the situation to position themselves morally above those who had donated more at the beginning of the crisis also seemed like a brazen move. Speaking of brazen people, at that instant the man of the legends appeared. The homeless Joe, also known as Brother Lee. He looked much worse than in previous days, fragile, sick, and much thinner. It had been a long time since Fong had seen his brother. Brother Lee claimed that he wasn't doing so badly, but it was clear that he was. According to him, he was just shaking because he was nervous and helpless, not to mention the cold. He was far from okay. Finally, Brother Lee admitted that he had been having a hard time, depending only on water to suppress his hunger, since he had no food left. When the donation campaign was in full swing, he donated most of his resources to the committee. At the end, his own supplies ran out sooner than promised. The end of the snowstorm. Also, the rations that the committee distributed were too few. If Brother Lee had known how bad it was going to be, the Kima would have kept more of his personal reserve. Realizing that he had a possible solution for Brother Lee's problem, Fong approached him to whisper a favor. Brother Lee backed away in disbelief. Fong offered him 4 packs of instant noodles and 2 sausages to do a simple job. Fong emphasized that this would considerably affect his supplies. The gangster took it as if his little brother was looking for an excuse to give him food. He was moved to tears, promising to remember his goodwill forever. Brother Lee grabbed Fong sincerely and assured him that this small matter would be resolved without problems. As for the food, he could stop by Feng's house later. But first, Brother Lee really needed something to fill his stomach, so he lined up to get rations. Fong was pleased with the perfect deal he had made. With just a few packs of noodles and sausages, he wouldn't have to go down there personally to gather information in the future. He felt a little bad for Brother Lee, but it wasn't that important to meddle in other people's affairs when he could be resting comfortably on his couch, eating delicious food and playing games. Fong would have had a perfect trip in the underground parking lot if he hadn't been seen by another familiar face. After hearing his name, the next thing he saw was a palm heading towards his face. The greeting of why and for today was a crisp slap on Feng's cheek. He didn't expect to be assaulted so early in the day and didn't know how to react to this bad scenario. With anger in her eyes, Juina told Fong that he had been a disappointment. The witch proceeded to yell at him for not responding to her messages, asking for food, making sure to raise her voice so that everyone in the underground parking lot could hear. Fong was stunned. He just stood there, trying to process what was happening. The witch he had been playing with had just slapped him in front of everyone. He hadn't even paid off his debts from his past life, and now she was entering his space and slapping him for no reason. At that moment, with his anger rising at an alarming rate, he thought that Lejuna still saw him as that pathetic weakling, easy to harass. He remained silent for a few moments, while she was reprimanding him for not answering. She called him deaf and dumb and demanded an answer to her questions. Fong took a deep breath, the air condensed from the cold, then proceeded to put on another number. He sincerely apologized to Juina, explaining that his supplies had been stolen. He had placed the food he was going to deliver outside his door for a moment to get his keys, but when he returned, the boxes of supplies were gone. Fong explained that he had tried to find the responsible person, but he hadn't gotten any clues. At that moment, she looked like a totally desperate person, like an addict looking for their next dose. While she asked him if he still had any food saved, Fong replied that he barely had enough left for a few days, if he rationed 1 meal a day. Upon hearing that there was still some food left, Juina's out-of-control expression lit up with an embarrassed smile. However, when she asked him to share half of his food, and that he eat only once every 2 days, so that they could both survive together, Her attitude was disturbing. Feng could hardly believe how brazen she could be, capable of making such a selfish proposal so calmly. It was as if she saw him only as a tool to get what she needed. Nothing more. Despite this, Feng chose to play along. He smiled warmly and accepted the plan, acting as if he were a man, willing to share his resources equally with her. He even asked her for the food at that moment, but he preferred to say that he would deliver it at night, explaining that he had to prepare some packaging. Back in his apartment, Juina wished him luck and reminded him to be careful with the flu that was going around. Feng responded without much interest, while his mind was already planning a revenge. At 8 p.m., Juina began to harass him for the food. She was so impatient that she even went up to the lobby near his room. By 9:30, she was already alone in the hallways, shivering from the cold and feeling miserable. Meanwhile, Feng was enjoying his favorite activity, sending messages to her with some bait, only to completely ignore her afterwards. The elevator was broken due to the cold and lack of maintenance, so if she wanted to make a scene, she would have to go up the stairs, seeing that she had no other choice. Queen swallowed her pride and started climbing the steps. Halfway through, exhaustion took over her, and the cold made her shiver unbearably. It was a test of endurance, but if it weren't for the supplies, she probably wouldn't have made all this effort. Tiredness was hitting her hard, as she had been several days without eating well. Each step up the stairs stole a little more of her energy. Coincidentally, the emergency lights on the upper floors were also off, which made her ascent even more somber and terrifying upon hearing a strange noise. A nervous Juina asked who was there. Just then, a black bag fell from the upper floors, almost landing on her head. Surprised and paralyzed, she stood still waiting for the bag to hit her. When it fell with a loud thud, the emergency lights came on, and a white powder covered the entire staircase. The cheerful and confident Lejuno was soaked in flour, with the powder covering her completely, and in front of her was Feng. He explained that he had fallen asleep, but that when he saw her messages, he ran down with the supplies. When the light went out, he accidentally dropped the bag of flour, which resulted in the chaotic scene. As she wiped the flour and plastic off her clothes, Lejuina felt ashamed with her true personality, showing traces of displeasure. Feng, for his part, was enjoying the scene. He had planned this cruel joke especially for her, but he wasn't done yet. He picked up another plastic bag and told the witch that he had packed the rest of the supplies for her. Upon inspecting it, she noticed that most of the food and products were already moldy. They looked more like garbage than edible food, making a fool of herself. Feng scratched the back of his head and claimed that he worked extra hard to keep these works in inventory. He even had decomposing meat mixed in there. Then he skillfully changed his attitude, acting offended. He grabbed the plastic bag and told her to return it if she didn't like it, fearing to spend another day without eating. The witch quickly took the bag from him, saying that she wanted it. Feng carefully looked her up and down and mocked himself. In front of him was the so-called goddess that he had been chasing with all his might before. Right now she looked more like a homeless addict, trapped outside on a winter night. She was rummaging in the garbage bag, trying to find something edible in the pile of mold. She even greedily grabbed the remaining bag of flour from Feng's hand. Juina was celebrating even with half a pack of flour, not caring that minutes before she had been covered with that white powder. Then she left without saying thank you or goodbye. But Feng didn't care. Giving her his garbage, literal to eat, should be enough to cause her some stomach problems for a few days. Taking a shower in this weather was also impossible, so she would have to walk with all that flour stuck to her body. For a while Feng happily returned to his house, he began to feel something strange. He disguised it as if he hadn't noticed, but there was something moving in the background, staying alert. Feng acted naturally, heading to his unit. He left the staircase and walked as if nothing was wrong. A shadow of a figure followed his steps. A few seconds later, it was definitely a person, judging by the snow boots they were wearing. Taking advantage of the element of surprise, Feng hid behind the door and launched himself on the unknown figure that was following him. He made sure to restrain the mysterious person, firmly and aggressively, throwing them to the ground just when he was about to hit the guy who was trying to spy on him. Something made Feng stop his hostility. The person who was following him turned out to be a girl with messy hair, sleepy eyes, and ultra-thick glasses. What the hell is going on? Thought Fong, only being able to think of one reason why. She could be there at such a late hour. She must have been spying on him. And our hero wanted to discover her intentions. But the only thing he got in response was silence and an empty look from under her glasses. She didn't say a word, and Fong, surprised by her behavior, decided to use more forceful arguments. To make her talk, he threatened to take off her coat right there in the cold if she didn't say anything. But even that wasn't enough to make her talk. Fong got tired of playing with her and decided to let her go. This time, but next time, maybe she wouldn't be able to count on such a favor. If she spied on him now, he would have to put aside his silent games and hurry to his house before he got cold. When our hero was about to leave, he suddenly felt someone grab his sleeve. This silent girl was not going to let him go so easily. Although Fong didn't understand what she wanted from him, she on the other hand just looked at him and remained silent. Fong told her to stop looking at him, and even threatened to leave if she didn't tell him what she wanted. But instead of answering, she pointed at something with her hand and pulled our hero with it. Even a clueless guy like Fong realized that they were showing him something. They arrived at her room. Surprisingly, it was warm and bright inside. Our hero was speechless as he looked around. He noticed piles of boxes of supplies. Sure, some of them were empty, and the room was full of garbage. But the fact that this girl had so many supplies, weeks after the apocalypse began, was incredible. Fong asked her directly if she knew beforehand that the ice apocalypse would begin. And surprisingly, she finally spoke. Although she said strange things, it turned out that she herself had done the calculations and obtained the result that predicted a future ice age. She turned out to be the same person who had been writing in the community chat about the impending ice age apocalypse before it actually began. Fem naturally did not understand what she was talking about at all. A guy like him had a hard time grasping that with proper research and calculations, it is possible to anticipate future events without being a reborn return. But Fong sensed that was not the reason why she had called him to her room, and he was right. She quickly showed him her true interest. The girl had multiple screens in her room, all showing recordings from security cameras, and in each of them he appeared. In the first video, he saw him picking his nose while carrying boxes in an elevator. In the second, a delivery man was bringing him a dozen gas cans. In the third, Brotherly was bringing him a gun case, and so on. Fong was not wrong in his first impression. She had in fact been spying on him for a long time. Now she seemed to feel more comfortable than ever, without hesitation changing her clothes right in front of him. Her room was too warm to keep wearing winter clothes, so Fong, somewhat clumsy, misinterpreted the situation and asked her what the hell she was doing. She replied that it was simply hot. The situation became stranger, and Fong knew that he should stay there until this matter was resolved. He had understood that she had been observing him because she suspected his behavior by starting to store supplies long before the snow arrived. Fortunately, her monitoring was not to blackmail him, but to assess whether he was smart enough to cooperate. Now, it only remained to know what cooperation meant to her, given that she found it difficult to communicate. The girl decided it was better to show him what she wanted to do. Fong couldn't imagine what she hoped to do with all those movements. Of course, by taking a generator from behind the bed, he thought he would have some surprise. But in reality, she only needed his help to get it started. She was an expert in technology and computers, but lacked the necessary practical skills to survive in her day-to-day. After a while, the generator was running smoothly. Fong hoped that would be the last of her requests, but it wasn't so. With a pleading look, the girl asked for help again, this time with the water heater. Fong, without wasting time, set it up quickly, making it clear that now she would have hot water 24 hours a day, thanks to the generator. Still, he advised her not to waste water and to always close the tap when she wasn't using it. Then she asked for assistance with the refrigerator, which was an absolute chaos. Fong had to teach her that raw meat must go in the freezer, not in the fridge or otherwise. It would decompose quickly. He even had to show her how to change and connect the gas cans to the stove. She had to remember the safety precautions and clearly repeat all her actions. From there, things only got more complicated. Fong had to teach her how to cook and grill food on the fire. Finally, when our hero was completely exhausted, a delicious dinner was ready, and he advised her to eat. While the food was still hot, He himself couldn't understand how he had reached this life, spending all day taking care of an adult child. His new friend's ability to take care of herself was too low, although she didn't seem ashamed in the least. The dinner was simply delicious. Fong realized that there was no way to understand this matter, and clumsily excused himself, saying he was just kidding. He was incredibly tired from the day, and could dream of nothing more than his warm bed. It turned out that he was not the only one tired during the day. When he turned his attention to the girl, she was already asleep, and the table with food as a bed suited her quite well. This was the first time that Fong saw someone fall asleep while eating, but still decided to carry her to bed for the night. The snowfall only intensified and the temperature dropped even further. Fong had just woken up and already had visitors demanding his attention. It was the same girl again. She had brought gifts to thank him for his help. Even our hero was surprised by her generosity. She had brought so much, but after Fong moved the boxes aside, she kept standing at the door and had no intention of leaving. She had brought a generator with her and asked him to teach her. Once again, she didn't seem to have memorized yesterday's lessons, so Fong had to start from scratch. After a few days talking with the girl, he realized she was a complete fool when it came to survival. She also lacked a lot of common sense, an understanding of what was appropriate and what wasn't. But she didn't give up. After a while, she finally managed to cook something remotely edible that resembled a meal. Even Fong considered this cooking skill an improvement. Previously, not even dogs would want to eat something like that. But in an ice apocalypse, even humans would line up for a meal like that. After so long, Fong finally decided to find out the girl's name. She introduced herself as Jo Shingon. It was still a mystery to Fong because she spoke so strangely. And what was wrong with her? But he wasn't going to leave her to her fate. Meanwhile, down in the basement, where supplies were distributed to residents, in need things were not calm at all. The residents, hungry, were fighting each other for the little that remained of supplies. Chaos reigned, and the residents started stealing supplies from each other, arguing that no one could prove who each thing belonged to. The weak simply fell helplessly, and the strong tried to grab more. It seemed that the peaceful days in that community were over. People were fighting for the resources they felt they were entitled to. They guarded what little they managed to obtain, as if it were their life, and any attempt at theft quickly degenerated into senseless violence. Mr. Hank remained calm throughout the storm. He amplified the volume of the megaphone he was holding and stopped the fight completely, while everyone covered their ears in pain. After a few seconds of that annoying feedback sound, Mr. Jang finally addressed his fellow survivors. He asked them if they had already had enough of fight. He lifted one of the brutally beaten men and explained that just for those few remaining resources, they were risking their lives. But the masses were still angry. Mr. Jan was the one who suggested the donation system, and now they only received one pack of noodles every few days. If they didn't die fighting, they would die of hunger. Mr. Jang pretended he was listening to their complaints about the problem of resource distribution, or the lack thereof. Mr. Jang raised the question of who had caused the situation in the first place, and urged them to think carefully. The irritated masses blamed him for this. He raised a piece of bread and began to work his magic, while helping people remember what was really happening. The bread that originally sold for a few dollars could now be purchased from those with abundant resources for tens or even hundreds of dollars. The elite squeezed the unfortunate until they were dry. It reached the point of dividing a piece of bread into 5 or 10 pieces to auction them. They used the disaster to enrich themselves. As for those in the lower levels of the parking lot, they had already run out of money and resources, but there they were, fighting internally because of the system that used to work. They were killing each other, while the elites, who had abundant supplies, hoarded their wealth without donating to the common good. They were the ones who maliciously raised prices. And yet, here were the poor, starving and fighting to the death. Mr. Hank asked if that was fair, feeling that he now had the masses devouring his words. Mr. Hank urged everyone to stop what they were doing and unite to recover the resources that belonged to everyone. These citizens, hungry and furious, began to rationalize what they had just heard, convinced that they were being treated unfairly. Why were the rich the only ones getting all the benefits, while the rest of them had to fight alone to avoid starvation and death? Mr. Jang Watch how the pieces of the puzzle fit together on their own. After planting a seed of hatred in people's minds, the dissatisfaction and anger that the masses felt was directed towards the other residents of the building. Seeing the boil of violence, the chaos and despair, Mr. Jang smiled silently amidst the growing chaos. The homeless Joe, also known as Brother Lee, was the only one who could see through that speech. The people had become practically crazy, and something big was about to happen. He had to inform Feng as soon as possible. In Feng's room, he was resting, pretending to read a book while snoring. He was woken up by the ringtone of his phone. He received the messages from Brother Lee about the problems that were brewing in the parking lot. As Mr. Yin continued to incite the crowd, people began to plot plans to take from others what they had. Wandering the hallways, they went door to door, using force to open locks. These looters were armed and ready for anything. Brother Lee suggested to Feng that he take shelter and avoid confronting these individuals directly. Uncontrolled, all he could do was wait that the homeless Joe could defend himself outside. Feng had not anticipated that things would take such a dangerous turn. Although he had acquired a couple of weapons for extreme situations, the idea of using them against other people was disturbing to him. Besides, if the organized crowd discovered where he kept his resources, they wouldn't hesitate to attack him mercilessly. They would devour him, leaving him with nothing. And for that, he had to be prepared for any eventuality. For now, he took out wires, tools, and some fire extinguishers from the storeroom. With these elements, he tried to set up an improvised trap at the door, using wires to secure the knob. After finishing his system, he unspooled the wires on the floor carefully. But his little project was interrupted by a sudden blackout. From the heights, it was clear that all the buildings in the area had lost power. At the same time, some people tried to contact the administration, but they had long failed to do so. Feng thought that, due to the snowstorm and the excessive use of electricity, while people were trying to stay warm, this blackout was inevitable. The snow had accumulated everywhere, and the low outdoor temperatures prevented repairs from being made. With all that in mind, Feng feared that the lack of power and the loss of signal could last a long time. When people realized that the electricity would not return, panic would break out and everything would get worse. That panic would only fuel a much more violent rebellion, and that's when the real chaos would begin. 30 minutes before the power went out, the witch Leona devoured noodles avidly. Her benefactor kept bragging about how he had acquired resources at inflated prices, up to 50 times the original value. The poor, unable to resist, had been forced to sell everything they had. With $500,000, he began to auction off supplies, leaving the neediest to confront each other, to obtain only a fraction of what they needed. With this method, the blonde quickly became rich. He caressed Leona's face and asked her if she thought she had made the right decision. By following him, the witch smiled and nodded with satisfaction. The man was already thinking about how to use his money to have complete control over her, as long as he could by her loyalty. However, their moment was interrupted by the noises of footsteps rushing through the hallway. It was the looters from the parking lot, who were bringing tools to force entry. At midnight, the blonde heard himself mentioned in the group chat as the main culprit for the price increases. The looters began to bang and kick the door, trying to force it open. He was paralyzed, not knowing what to do, while the crowd continued to try to get in. Finally, the group of hungry followers of Mr. Jang reached its peak. The snowstorm roared outside with no signs of letting up. Meanwhile, inside Feng's shelter, chaos was building up. Wires and supplies covered the floor. He continued to work on his improvised home alone-style trap to secure the door, creating more mess. Although he did everything he could to secure it, the power reading indicated that no current was flowing. Just when he was wondering what had failed, the wires he had quickly tied exploded and started to catch fire. The wire must have been energized at that instant. He put out the fire on the wire, but he still couldn't understand what he was doing wrong, nor why the process was so difficult. If at least the internet was working, this wouldn't have been a problem at all. Unfortunately, someone started banging on his door. Without having managed to set his trap in time, Feng got up and carefully looked through the keyhole to confirm who was on the other side of the door. He didn't see a face, but he saw someone of very short stature, with her hair sticking out. It was that outcast girl again. This time she came with her usual indifferent face. While asking for help, it wasn't a good time for Fong, since he was busy trying to improvise some traps inside. But then, he remembered the incident that had sent him back to the past, when he was seduced by a witch and beaten by a madman. He released the doorknob, fearful of what might be lurking on the other side. Fong warned the girl that people were breaking down doors and stealing supplies. Instead of letting her in alone, he told her to quickly return to her home, since he wasn't going to open the door for her. The outcast girl remained in the dark and cold hallway. Silence filled the air until she started banging on the door harder and louder. When Fong continued to refuse to let her in, she chose to sit down and shiver on the threshold floor. The cold was already affecting her, and the voices of the looters began to sound louder. As they reached Feng's floor, they didn't care how many residents lived on the 18th floor. They were simply coming to open all the doors. Two rough-looking men walked through the hallway of the 18th floor and celebrated the fact that they were the first to arrive. They immediately divided the rooms to loot. By chance, Feng's room was the closest. One of the looters used a crowbar to start working on the door. They introduced themselves as people delivering resources. First to see if anyone was inside, Feng had taken the girl and covered her mouth to prevent any noise. When the looters heard no response from inside, they proceeded to try to force the door. Using a single crowbar, Feng quietly assured the outcast girl that those bastards wouldn't be able to make a scratch on his door. Reinforced upon hearing his reassuring words, she calmed down visibly. The doorknob went up and down several times, but the looters couldn't find a way to get in. Seeing that the resistant door wasn't getting them anywhere, they decided to mark Feng's place and continue to the next door. Luckily, the reinforced door and knob were installed with 5 centimeters iron plates, thick, that reinforced the frame. Even the contractor who installed it was surprised. Feng was so busy feeling good about his decisions that he forgot to release the girl's mouth. She was too scared to make a noise and attract attention. Still, the outcast girl thanked him for letting her in. Before the looters saw her sitting outside, they chose to wait a few more minutes just to be sure. But it seemed that those looters had already left. Feng immediately returned to fixing his trap. If he managed to do it right, those who dared to touch his door again would be electrocuted to death. The curious girl asked him what he was doing, and he presented it as his measure of defense against electrocution. He even condescendingly told her that she wouldn't understand, even if he explained it. In reality, he himself didn't understand how it worked, and was verifying that installing this electrocution device was proving impossible. What Feng didn't know was that the outcast girl was an expert in security systems and manipulation of voltages, concepts that she mastered with ease from her position. She gave him precise instructions. He had to cut the power and wrap the bare wire around the doorknob. Carefully then, they connected a second wire from the electrical panel to the knob and finally restored the power supply. When measuring the current on the knob, the meter showed a high level of electricity. Feng, surprised, asked her how she knew so much about such technical topics. She responded confidently that the eye of the evil king granted her the power to see the truth behind everything. Once the trap was ready thanks to her help, Feng asked her what else she needed. The girl didn't waste time telling stories. She simply emptied her backpack onto the sofa, completely ignoring Feng. Then, with a firm look, she declared that she would stay there from now on, as the true eye of the evil king. Feng took a moment to assimilate what he had just heard. He couldn't believe that this girl thought to stay in his private space and insisted desperately that she go back to her home. He was so agitated by the situation that he tripped over the wires on the floor. While trying to balance himself, he fell in an awkward way, hitting the ground with a thud on his hands. A purple glow shone, emitting a strange energy. Although the fall should have hurt, it didn't. It was then that he realized that the coffee table that previously seemed solid had now become malleable, almost like clay. It had been his fall that had caused this. Feng looked at the purple light that still floated around his hands and began to connect the dots. That light must have something to do with the change in the table. Not only that, even the tools near him had changed, becoming soft to the touch. He took a hammer, and by pressing it, the metal head bent as if it were plasticine. Clearly, that purple light had the power to transform objects. softening them in some way. The outcast girl observed the strange phenomenon in complete silence, so quietly that Feng almost forgot that he wasn't alone, absorbed in discovering his new ability. He didn't notice her presence. Finally, she broke the silence and looked at him with a blank expression, before labeling him as an emissary, chosen by the true eye of the evil king. Feng, somewhat bewildered, decided to play along, assuming the role of subordinate chosen by the evil king. Although without revealing all that he had discovered about his power, she suggested that they help each other, which implied that his apartment should be shared. When Feng was about to flatly reject her, the girl was already heading towards one of the rooms, as if it were hers. She hadn't even discussed the proposal, but she already thought that they were building a refuge for the evil king. In the end, it wasn't that bad, so he let her do as she pleased. The most important thing at that time was to understand how that purple light worked. At first glance, it seemed that it had the ability to soften things, but maybe there was more to it than met the eye. The event that triggered all this was when he tripped over the wires and almost fell on the coffee table that had somehow become soft. Feng thought that he could try to recreate that same feeling, to re-invoke the power. After concentrating for a while on that mental image, he managed to invoke the purple light again. Now he was beginning to learn how to call his abilities more automatically. The first thing he tried was to manipulate the wires that had caused all this discovery in the first place. Then he ventured to test it on other things, like a sharp kitchen knife. Curious, he activated the purple light, and its cloudy essence quickly absorbed the entire blade. He was surprised to see that the softening effect also worked on steel without problems. It became so soft that the previously sharp knife now felt like jelly, wrapping around his skin. After that, he had a feast, testing this softening touch on many other materials. Any household material he could imagine was susceptible to the power. The more he used the purple light, the softer they became. Apart from altering the softness of an object, there were no other changes. By itself, the purple light was quite useless and impractical. Then another idea occurred to Feng, a concept with which he was already familiar. What would happen if he combined two different types of light? What if he mixed the purple light with the green one and applied them at the same time on a softened object? He grabbed the kitchen knife, which had been left soft and melted, and applied the purple and green lights on it and yelled. To his surprise, it really worked. The melted and softened knife returned to its solid state, hard and sharp as always. In fact, he could use the blade as a mirror, considering it polished. That remained after applying the combined lights. He looked around and found a tissue box lying around, curious. Feng did the same with a piece of toilet paper and tried to bend it out of shape. It took a lot of effort to do it, which meant that he could change the hardness of an object when two different lights were combined. Besides the hardness that the green and purple lights granted those objects was quite extreme. Speaking of hardness, it wouldn't have a very important and practical application for this ability. Meanwhile, the owners who had appropriated supplies from other people were beginning to act selfishly, as they refused to hand over the resources they had stolen, choosing to keep them for themselves for fear of running out of them. They argued that they didn't want to share their loot with women and the elderly, but they still had to keep it secret, or they could get into trouble if it leaked. While the looters were planning their blatant crime, one of them noticed something strange happening on the walls. To their disbelief, the wall of the 18th floor seemed to be writhing, and when illuminating its surface, a face began to emerge from what appeared to be a solid wall of concrete. It was moving and wrinkling, as if it were trying to break free from the embrace of the walls. The looters might be hardened criminals when they were looting resources, but this was something inexplicable and absolutely terrifying. As soon as the arms of the face came together, as if it were a ghostly apparition trying to break through the mortal realm, it was a total blackout. Anyone would have thought that they were witnessing paranormal activity. In real life, the looters quickly ran to the floor below, afraid of what the 18th floor might have in store for them. Meanwhile, Feng struggled to breathe as he stretched the soft walls with his face. It was quite a difficult task. He had to get out of that mess, soft and clay-like, before running out of oxygen. For the sake of experimentation, he chose one of his walls as a testing ground for his combined powers of purple and green light. But applying these lights to a whole wall turned out to be too exhausting. After a while, he managed to make large amounts of light come together and mix with each other. It was an extremely exhausting process, but it gave him a wall, even harder and more resistant than the one he already had. To test it, he pulled out a mallet to verify. He stood in front of the reinforced wall and raised the mallet, determined to check if he had succeeded. With an expression of anticipation, he began. Fong raised the mallet with all his strength and slammed it against the wall with a firm blow. He repeated the process several times until his hands were trembling with exhaustion and he could barely hold the mallet correctly. However, all that effort paid off, as the wall turned out to be incredibly resistant. Not even with all his strength could he scratch its surface. Meanwhile, in the underground parking lot, many of the looters had returned to hand over a portion of what they had stolen. A nervous man scratched his head and apologized for having gotten so little. Just some food. He looked visibly tense, and when someone patted him on the shoulder, his nervousness increased even more. The man who had touched was one of the Jean brothers, who quickly threw him to the ground, holding his arms tightly and demanding that he tell him where he had hidden the rest of the food. The looter flatly denied having more supplies, but Brother Jin had clearly seen him carrying 3 large bags before handing over only a small one. Despite the pressure on his arms, the looter continued, denying that he had more food stored, as he didn't seem willing to talk with just a little pain. Brother Jim thought that maybe a good beating would make him confess. However, just as he was about to hit the looter, a hand calmly stopped him. It was Mr. Hank, who with a calm voice suggested that they let the looter go, since if there really was anything else to hide, it would be resolved in another way. He listened attentively to the case of the food theft that was supposed to be shared among everyone, and decided to handle the situation his way. Finally, Brother Jean agreed. He released the looter and pushed him to the ground. When the looter looked up, he saw Mr. Jang offering him a friendly hand. Mr. Jang's smile had the power to calm everyone, but there was always something unsettling about his kindness. After a few minutes of conversation, the looter confessed and took out 2 extra large bags of food that he had hidden. Ashamed, he explained that he had 5 people in his home and the distributed ration was not enough for everyone. Upon hearing this, Mr. Jang took his own portion of food and generously gave it to the man, although the rules indicated that everyone should hand over what they had collected to receive rations based on the number of people in their homes. Mr. Hank understood the difficulties faced by those who were struggling to survive. The looter moved, almost broke into tears, thanking Mr. Hank for his generosity. Ashamed of his greed, he swore that if Mr. Hank ever needed anything, he would be at his service. Then, Mr. Jan addressed the crowd lined up in a row and urged them to collect their rations quickly and return to their homes. The Jean brothers, intrigued, couldn't help but ask how Mr. Jang had managed to get the looter to return so easily, everything stolen, and why he had given extra rations from his own share. Mr. Jang responded that he had done nothing extraordinary. He only helped the man understand an important lesson. The curious Jean brothers asked him to explain. Mr. Jang began to tell them about the history of his country, mentioning that on several occasions, disturbances and rebellions have been caused by the conflict of interests between different social classes. However, those disturbances were not only the result of greed, but of a collective social phenomenon. If a person was not arrested immediately, he didn't face trial in the courts. Since justice was influenced by popular pressure, all that Mr. Jang did was inform the man that if he broke the rules, the collective would no longer accept him. He would become a simple criminal thief, not to mention the punishment of the law. After the disaster passed, that guy would have to face the revenge of the owners, whom he had robbed. Those fears added up and made the decision easy. Uncle Lou watched everything from afar. As a mere spectator, he knew that Mr. Jang had deliberately left out the fact that, within those groups of looters, there would always be a leader guiding the actions of the collective. Heroes and even villains will always emerge in times of trouble, and he could see that potential in the guy Jay. As for our protagonist, he was still busy swinging his mallet in different parts of his house to make sure they were virtually indestructible. This activity was exhausting him quite a bit, but at least now he had invincible windows, now that the whole house had been reinforced, and the resistance verification was also finished. he could finally relax. At that moment, someone started knocking on his door again. This was becoming increasingly common. He walked softly across the floor and wondered if it was those resource-stealing neighbors. Again, upon reaching the entrance, he looked through the peephole to see what was going on. To his surprise, it was none other than Leona, calling his name with tears in her eyes, while shivering with cold. This was an extremely familiar scene. She began to talk about how she couldn't betray the feelings he had for her, that one can only understand someone's heart in difficult times, and that only someone who truly loved her would invest in her unconditionally. If he would just open the door, she would open her heart delighted. Feng's mind recalled the night he died. After being ambushed in his own room, he remembered how this witch and her partner made him look like a dead fool. Joe and this girl repeated the same words she told him before he died. This meant that outside that door, there was a man waiting to give him a mortal blow if he fell into the trick. Feng's first thought, now that he could finally take revenge, was to go get the weapon and kill this pair of dogs directly. But he stopped halfway. There was no electricity at that time, so the enemy, hidden in the dark, would have an advantage, while he would be in the open. Ji-Feng Chen couldn't kill with a single shot. He might lose his life if he used electric shocks. Getting two people to touch a trap at the same time would be virtually impossible. For now, he tried to calm down as best he could. As he turned off his generators, he only had one chance for this, and that was even more reason not to lose focus. He needed to analyze the situation calmly. The greatest threat was not the witch at the door, but the man hidden in the dark. Feng needed to locate his position and deliver a fatal blow. The first step might be a bit tricky, but he had prior knowledge of how this event happened. In the past, from what he remembered, that man should be hidden in the blind spot, behind the door. He estimated the approximate position of his killer through the wall, while tightly holding the mallet. Feng had an idea, although it would take some time to carry it out. It could be his best chance. By touching the surface of the wall, purple lights gathered in his hand. While hoping that this plan would work, Leona continued to act like a damsel in distress, desperately calling the name of Feng to be rescued. The man she had brought to kill and rob Feng was already beginning to change his mind, but she insisted that this loser. Feng had tons of resources, trucks loaded with supplies delivered a day before the disaster. Anyone would have taken the opportunity to loot enough resources to feed themselves for several days. But they made the mistake of choosing the wrong target, one with superpowers. The wall behind the killer transformed and moved like clay. A warhammer-shaped protrusion came out, apparently trying to break through the soft wall. The killer began to hear some strange noises nearby, but Leona was too focused on executing the deception. When the killer identified that the noise was coming from behind, it was already too late to turn around. A damned warhammer, covered with a soft cement wall, crashed against his jaw, undoubtedly breaking it with a destructive force. The witch recoiled in shock as she watched her partner in crime fly. Like a rag doll, she asked what had happened, but he was in no condition to speak. His body was shaking with pain and cold. It was then that the door, that seemed impossible to open, slowly opened with a creak. Feng shot out of his room with a fire extinguisher in his hand and a small sly smile on his face. The haggard witch looked at the supposed loser with fear. Before she could say another word, Feng let out, the fire extinguisher covering the witch with that white substance. While she screamed in pain, Leona was a good actress. She managed to maintain a soft tone while begging Feng to stop spraying her with the white substance. She even ingested some of it, which was not to be done. The witch coughed and coughed as her body began to decompose from the cold caused by the extinguishing agent. When she opened her eyes, she saw the blonde, the person she had brought, with his muscle to rob Feng on the ground, convulsing uncontrollably and asking for help desperately. Unfortunately for Leona, she was not in the best position to help. Feng's hand emerged from the fog of the extinguishing substance. As it reached for the witch, she reacted quickly, but he managed to grab her hair and scarf. At the same time, it must have been the adrenaline rushing through her body, but Leona managed to break free. Although she lost a handful of hair in the process, she was a slippery woman. She managed to stand up and run away while screaming, calling for help. Feng clicked his tongue as the witch escaped too fast. The same could not be said for the man he had hit with the warhammer. he was still struggling to stand. Driven by anger and frustration, Fong kicked him in the stomach, just as he was about to stomp on the man who had killed him in his past life. The blonde begged him to wait a second. This fool began mentioning his father's name and all that nonsense, promising that if Ji Feng touched him again, bad things would happen. Fong responded by giving another solid punch in the face, making it clear what he was going to do next. Fong didn't care who this guy's father was. He intended to inflict as much pain as possible and beat this rich kid until his heart was content. Seeing that threats wouldn't work, the blonde tried a more respectful approach. He called Fong brother, assuring that they didn't even have problems with each other. So the beating was totally unjustified. Enraged by the memories of his past life, Fong slammed the guy's head against the floor once more. Fong climbed onto his chest and continued raining down punches while expressing everything he had in his heart. This man had treated his life as if it was worthless. They killed him when he was just minding his own business, with his gloves painted in blood and his eyes full of malice. Fong urged the fool to say something. The blonde might have wanted to, but his jaws and mouth were too shattered to form another sentence. Fong got up and grabbed the modified baseball bat that was lying on the floor, holding the weapon that had ended his life, and started a new one. He looked at the helpless culprit lying on the ground, crying and coughing up blood, while demanding to know why they were treating him that way. Fong, filled with fury, raised the custom steel bat with nails and dropped it with all his strength on the blonde's face. The sound of bones breaking and the splattering blood filled the 18th floor hallway. He had finally gotten his revenge. He had killed the man who had killed him. Feng's blood was pumping hard. His adrenaline was starting to fade, and looking at the bloody scene in front of him, he realized the gravity of what he had done. He almost threw up at the gruesome sight, but managed to turn his head in time and empty his stomach on the ground. Trying to compose himself, he heard a familiar voice clearing her throat. He turned and saw the outcast girl sitting by the door, calmly playing with a man's blood. She had probably witnessed everything that had happened, and was now offering to help him with the mess. Despite the carnage, she didn't seem to be affected in the slightest. Fong was wary of her. Something didn't seem right, and he didn't intend to let her stay there. He used the excuse that more criminals could appear, seeking revenge at any time. So he suggested that she go to her house, so she wouldn't get caught in the crossfire. While taking his orange juice, she showed no signs of being worried about the threat. Fong really wanted her to leave for her safety, but the girl seemed determined to stay. There was no way to make her change her mind. Fong insisted that the coming days would be dangerous, and that they could both die. But she replied, leaving her glass of juice on the table with resolution, as if it were a declaration of intent. The girl assured him that the true power of the evil king would protect them, although at that moment, this power was exhausted and she needed to rest. Already tired of her mysterious attitude, Fong grabbed her by the arm before she could lock herself in the room. He demanded that she stop trying to escape with her enigmatic behavior and pay attention to him, since they were about to face something much more serious. She looked at his grip on her shoulder, then looked up and told him to open the door. Confused, Fong decided to follow her suggestion and looked through the door. What he saw left him completely shocked. Meanwhile, the underground parking lot was full of movement. Some people were blocking the way to others who had not yet received their rations. Although the food distribution system was already working again, there were not enough supplies for everyone. But the situation was relatively calm. Leona, who had managed to escape from Feng's grasp, had lined up with the others to receive her share. Now that she had nowhere to go, nor anyone to fawn over, she said her name and apartment number, and was given a piece of bread. The witch was resentful of how things had gone. The night before, her wealthy lover had not returned, after mysteriously falling without explanation. The only logical reason was that Fong had prepared a trap in advance, which only increased her curiosity about what he was hiding behind that door. Before the chaos, she had seen a flickering light and felt a warm breeze coming from the inside, indicating that there was some source of energy inside. Perhaps Fong had not only hoarded supplies, but had also been prepared for the disaster in advance. What she felt was bitterness. That cunning guy had told her nothing about what was coming. While he enjoyed the advantages, she settled for the works, since she wanted to discover what else Fong was hiding. Inside his apartment, Lost in thought and consumed by rage, she accidentally bumped into another man, who was also waiting in line to receive his rations. The man recognized her, and at that moment a mysterious light shone in her direction. Leona meets one of the guys who a long time ago had caused problems between the neighbors. But now that he's with her, he decides to invite her to spend time in the lobby of Building 5, where he and the others have lit a bonfire to warm up clearly in an attempt to spend time with a beautiful woman. Like her, Leona notices his intentions and prefers not to waste her time with people of this type, stating that she much prefers to warm up alone in her house. But then the man grabs her by the arm to stop her in order to tell her that he has a lot of food for her, inviting her to stay a few days. But his true intentions soon become apparent, especially when he reveals that he has always liked her a lot, but not for a serious relationship. The girl, tired of being treated this creepy way, decides to break free by swatting the air, ordering the guy to leave, still believing herself to be worthy and of such high value that she would not stoop to eating the garbage of someone like him. The man gets angry with her and again holds her tightly by the arm, now reclaiming her by saying that she cannot play innocent because she took supplies, posing as another person while no one was watching her. Leona tries to break free, but the man won't let her, and on top of that threatens to show everyone the type of person she really is by posing as someone from the committee. Little by little, the people around begin to get interested in the discussion, and some realize that Leona is not as good and innocent as they thought, which clearly makes her nervous, seeing that her good girl mask has started to fall. In an attack of desperation, she hits the man's face with her food, but this only makes him even more angry and raises his lantern to teach her a lesson, while insulting her in front of everyone. Just before he manages to touch her, someone stops him with a slap in the face, which is so strong that it sends him flying to the wall. While the public watches this in amazement, the one responsible states that women should not be treated in such a rude way. While the neighbors are frightened by the scene and go in search of Jen. To calm things down, we see that the one responsible for everything was Nurse Jean, who goes with Leona to ask if she's okay, and if the man didn't do anything to her, to which she assures that she is fine. But more than thanking her, she just tries not to focus on her, so that she doesn't give her a blow. John also offers her nurse card, promising that if she ever has problems, she can go to see her and she will take care of healing her. But right now, Leona's priority is to flee the scene before she gets into more trouble. At that moment, the man from before wakes up and throws himself at John, knocking her to the ground, furious that she got involved in his affairs, and raises his fists to attack her for interfering in his fun. But then, someone appears to stop him and smash him against the floor. The savior is Joe the Vagrant, who more than anything hates men who beat women, and that's why he decided to intervene. At that moment, Chief Jang arrives to check what is happening and calm the atmosphere. As soon as he makes himself present, the man gets up and claims that he saw Leona with a rich man. The witch allowed her to obtain supplies illegally, not to mention that he was responsible for raising the prices of the items. Leona tries desperately to defend herself, claiming that she did none of that. Joe gets upset with the man for daring to accuse her after attacking her. But before he can teach him a lesson, Zhang takes him by the coat and scolds him for having dishonored what the committee represents, that had been formed to give food to all those who need it and protect those who are most vulnerable. Due to his imposing presence, the man decides to calm down and admit that it was only his mistake, becoming very nervous when Zhang promises to kick him out if he causes trouble again. Then, he apologizes to everyone for having caused the scene and scare them. On top of that, he tries to invite both Joe and John. Joe doesn't think twice and starts to leave, sure that he prefers to go hungry rather than join a group of looters. Like them, John thinks the same, but she assures that if they ever have problems, they can come to her as soon as they both leave. Leona takes the opportunity and approaches Chief Jang, starting her act as a helpless girl, saying that she has always admired him, but never had the opportunity to tell him or be with him. So now she wants to make up for lost time. However, Hank rejects her, expressing that she seems confused. Then he makes her see that Joe knows how to fight and John heal others, but she doesn't have any skill that is useful to him. Because of that, he rejects her and leaves her with nothing, which frustrates the girl a lot, seeing that little by little, her charm stops working on men, determined to make herself noticed. Leona tries to offer Jang information about where there are supplies. Then we move to the protagonist's house, where he can witness with his own eyes Jo Shingen's special power, which consists of creating a hole in space, in which to store things indefinitely. Ben then, after discovering this, tried to ask her to take something out of her pocket dimension, but saying it is easier than doing it, since although she could put many things in her dimension, taking them out is difficult since her level of precision is very low. For this reason, Fong wonders what kind of place this is, inspecting it with his gaze, as Housingen takes things out, so he decides to explore it, putting his head into the wormhole. Upon entering, he discovers that there are a lot of things, and finally understands how it was that she was able to empty a whole supermarket in a single night, since the interior is filled with all the items. But still there seems to be a lot more space left. The bad thing is that he can't breathe. Not to mention that his body has suffered other problems. Apparently, it is very similar to outer space, since the lack of oxygen not only almost suffocated him, but the pressure too caused the water in his body to start flowing out, something that Housingen didn't know, because she can't get into the wormhole, and had never felt anything strange in her hand when taking things out of her dimension. After a while looking, she finally finds her target, but besides that she found many other things, which she starts to empty out quickly in the protagonist's house, filling it like it was an avalanche. While all this is happening, outside the protagonist's apartment, there's a group of people going up the stairs. Apparently they're the same men who tried to loot the place a while ago, but now they are more afraid to approach because of the monster they saw before. Among them, a guy with glasses makes fun of the fact that in the 21st century, they believe in things like ghosts and spirits, reminding them that Chief Hank entrusted them with the task of collecting, or rather stealing Fang's supplies, and they can't afford to disappoint him. Unfortunately, his men are still very scared, and they believe that Leona is only deceiving Hank, like she does with all the men. The guy with glasses gets annoyed and asks him to trust his boss, as he orders them to follow to the protagonist's house. Meanwhile, he and Housingen were watching everything from their phone. He had already foreseen the situation, so he prepared cameras in advance to be prepared. In fact, this wasn't the only idea that occurred to him, but he also has a plan B together with Jo Shingon, to which he asks her to act when the signal is given. But the problem is that she must time her attack well, or it won't work. Fong starts the time, and in turn the looters hear something in front of them. Some believe it is the ghost they found, but soon after, they see a lot of lights on at the end of the stairs. These turn out to be nothing more than toy cars, which jump towards them. But what they didn't know is that these had small explosives attached to them, which detonate at the moment they are right in front of them. These explosives were not harmful, but they did have a lot of chili powder inside, which works as a homemade pepper spray, ideal for making them blind for a while. This allows Fong to start with his next plan, which is to use a drone to launch another explosive. This is noticed by the looters, so they try to flee as soon as possible. At the same time, Housingen asks the protagonist if she should launch her weapon, but he asks her to get a little closer before launching it to ensure a successful shot. The problem comes when the guy with glasses stops running and relentlessly attacks the drone. Before this, Fong orders his friend to prevent them from damaging the drone, but the guy with glasses continues attacking the device nonstop. Due to this, the left side is damaged and stops working, so Housingen completely loses control over it, which eventually ends in failure for their mission. And with it, they lose the only drone they had, since shortly after Fang's countdown ends, a bunch of fireworks explode in the sky and illuminate the entire scene, causing a massive commotion. This explosion causes the drone to be further damaged, and little by little the propellers lose power. And with an altitude, Fong asks to find a place to land, and not drop it. But although Housingen manages to do it, the place where it has landed is outside a window of the stairs, so the protagonist must hurry to go get it before the cold or the looters destroy it, since it is very important for them. Before he leaves, Housingen warns him that there is a body near the stairs. This catches the protagonist's attention, who looks through the camera and discovers that it is Jo in his final moments, completely unconscious on the stairs. Fong thinks that he was also attacked by the looters, or that he is simply suffering from hunger. So he decides to go out and see what is happening. not without first warning Jo Shingon not to open the door without him. However, before leaving, she gives him a communicator so that they can stay in contact at all times. Although right now Feng is worried, as he hopes not to have to use his toy. Perhaps he had obtained it for the apocalypse, but that doesn't mean he wants to use it. The protagonist leaves the house and begins to go down the stairs, armed and with his flashlight. Meanwhile, Hao Singen checks that each of the floors he crosses are clear, as if she were a general in a shooting game. According to the drone's measurement, the outside temperature is almost minus 50 degrees below zero, which means that without proper protection, a normal person would freeze in just half an hour. That is why he must act quickly, since if Joe remains in these conditions too long, his life could be in danger. So he must hurry. At the same time, in the neighborhood committee, the guy with glasses reports everything he has seen to the boss, Hank, who notes everything, while giving orders to give them 3 layers of warm clothing as a reward, in addition to some bags of food, to demonstrate that he will never neglect those who contribute to the neighbors, which allows him to earn the appreciation of these men. From a corner, Leona asks fearfully if she can join him now, but Jan rejects her again. First, because they have not been able to confirm that their friend has done this, and second, because if it weren't for Uncle Lou, he wouldn't have believed her words, that someone had been bringing supplies to the floor. 18 in other words. So far Leona has only offered him promises, but none of them have been demonstrated or proven, so she still has nothing that is useful to him. That is why he orders his men to prepare everything for an expedition, and that they also give a tool to Leona, since whether her information is true or not, he plans to give her a chance to prove her worth now. On her next mission, Leona sees this as her opportunity to be back on top, but when she holds the steel pipe in her hands, she understands that this won't be easy. And if she doesn't prove to be someone useful for Jang's plans, she will not have another chance to have a good life. Just before embarking on the search, Jang warns everyone that each of them is an important member of the committee, and they cannot afford to get hurt, so they must be very careful when going up. That said all, the group begins its expedition to the higher floors, slowly going up the stairs all together. Upon reaching high enough, they find Joe's body lying, to which they quickly give hot water, so he reacts. But it is so boiling that it ends up burning his mouth, which serves to wake him up easily. Upon regaining consciousness, he realizes the situation he is in, and all he can say is that he is unlucky. Among Jang's men, one of them gets irritated by Joe's ungrateful attitude, ordering him to thank Jang for having saved his life. However, Joe, the vagrant, becomes enraged with them and states that if he should thank someone, it's to those who steal the supplies, because for him, they're just villainous people, pretending to be heroes. This further irritates the man, but Jang stops him before causing a scene, and takes the opportunity once again to ask him to join them, to overcome the cold crisis together, something that Joe refuses again, as he has done thousands of times before. The guy from before keeps saying that he is ungrateful, but Joe has no more business with them, so he tries to leave, thinking that they can't force him to join them. At that moment, Hank firmly holds him by the shoulder, asking him if he has some kind of problem with them, while assuring him that he only wants to recruit him, so that the weakest have a hope of surviving. Thanks to his strength, Joe gets even more enraged by his insistence, and claims for giving food to everyone every 3 days, which is not very different from leaving him with nothing. Besides, Joe has no family, to which he can resort to manipulate him, so it is impossible for him to fall into one of his traps. While all this is happening, the protagonist is listening to them from above, on the stairs, and confirms his suspicion that Hank doesn't want to help people, since he only feeds them every 3 days. When analyzing it a little better, he realizes that Jang's plan is to recruit young people who will serve as his labor force, while also accepting the old to look like a hero. The guy from before grabs Joe by the coat, ordering him that if he doesn't join, he better leave and leave them alone. But in response, Joe headbutts him, willing not to move so as not to let them pass. But then, Hank gives the order for everyone to launch themselves against him with their weapons. Despite this, Joe continues acting tough and ready to face them. But Feng knows that in those conditions, he would fall at any moment from exhaustion, so he must help him. The problem is that there are too many enemies for the two of them, even if he intervenes himself. No matter how hard they try, or how good a fighter Joe is, neither of them, in their current state, can face so many people at once. Even knowing all this, he can't just stand idly by while Joe, who has helped him many times, is getting a beating. So in one way or another, he needs to intervene to save him. That is why he decides to use his last resort and takes out his toy from his pocket, although he doesn't want to use it. In turn, Joe is cornered by Jang's men, still trying to look tough. But then he hears something from above, feeling that very soon things are going to change. At that moment, a shot rings out, which leaves a hole in the floor of the stairs, and also makes the guy who was fighting against Joe fall. Not only him, but everyone present is paralyzed by how close that bullet passed, putting on alert immediately to check what happened. Everyone knows that it is a firearm, something that should not be possible, since that is prohibited in the country. And in the midst of all the chaos, the protagonist appears pointing at them, ordering everyone not to move. The already tense scene becomes even more frozen, and not by the cold, but because at any moment, Foe might shoot again, and a bullet could go to one of them. Not even Joe the vagrant can believe that his friend is using a weapon, even in a moment like this. From the crowd, Jang observes everything with total calm and serenity, while on the other hand, Leona cannot believe that the protagonist has dared to go out, and on top of that has a weapon. While everyone remains frozen by fear, Fong gives the keys to his house to Joe, so that they slowly back away to his house. Without losing sight of the group of looters, these ask Chief Jang what to do, since they can't let them go, so they think about attacking when they are unprepared. But another shot forces them to leave that idea. Quickly, Fong realized what they were planning, so he orders them again that under no circumstances they move unless they want him to shoot at them. Since he cannot trust their goodwill to let them go, he orders them to throw their weapons on the ground and kneel. Slowly, the looters do as he says and sit on the floor, with their weapons out of their reach. This is the ideal time to leave. And while Joe goes up the stairs behind the protagonist, he keeps watching the looters so that they don't try anything strange, reminding them all the time that if anyone tries to attack them, he's going to shoot. In a few moments, the protagonist and his friend manage to leave the scene, returning to his house, leaving Jang and his team alone. This last one asks the others if they know the protagonist, to which Leona takes the opportunity to look important, since she knows him. After revealing his name and that they were going to his house, one of the looters grabs her by the neck and claims her for not having told them that he had a weapon. But Leona also didn't know that he had that, this being the first time she is telling the truth. As always, Jang appears in the middle of them to calm things down, since due to what they have just witnessed, he assumes that he can trust Leona even a little bit. He begins to tell everyone that if the protagonist has a firearm, then it is very likely that he has other supplies. Little by little, people begin to realize that Jang is right, but they also think it was Foam, the one responsible for the price increase, something that even Hank begins to believe. Also, one of his men asks him if they should continue with the plan, fearing that the protagonist will shoot them if they get too close. But Hank calms him down, telling him that if he were capable of doing so, then he would have already shot them at the first opportunity. Besides, it is impossible for them to stay hidden in his room forever. Nevertheless, he knows that as they are, they have no chance of winning the fight. So he orders everyone to retreat for now, to prepare security measures against Foam, and then come back, motivating them to take his room as soon as possible. We move on to see Joe and Foam, who have finally arrived at the apartment. But Joe has trouble opening the door due to the extreme cold. Fortunately, no one followed him, so they don't need to be so alert. But when Joe opens the door, he feels an intense heat that shocks him for a moment. Foam asks him to react and enter quickly before someone arrives. And that's what they do when entering the protagonist's house. Joe is amazed by everything there, from the generators and the fire to the room full of supplies. This place is very well prepared for the glacial apocalypse, something Joe had not expected to see in his friend's house. While they talk, House Shingon peeks through a door demanding his drone, to which the protagonist realizes that he forgot to pick it up. Joe doesn't understand what they are talking about. But after 2 hours, the three friends are eating in the living room, moment in which Joe finally understands everything that happens and how it is that Feng and Jo Shingon managed to predict the snowstorm, which makes him think that studying does serve a purpose. After all, Feng apologizes to Joe for not having told him about his shelter before, since he was afraid that information would leak and everything would have turned out bad. But Joe only feels gratitude because the protagonist saved him from the looters. Feng expresses that he is also grateful to Joe because he has helped him on more than one occasion, and that's why he can stay with him for a while. After agreeing to this, Joe warns him that the situation in the building has changed a lot since the blackout. He then tells him how Jang began looting homes and distributing supplies to everyone. But although some follow him, others like Joe resist joining his group. When some of them were leaving, Hank didn't seem to care. But it wasn't long before he sent his men to eliminate them and reduce the threats to his power. The most loyal to him are the Kim brothers, who carry out each of his orders and who confronted Joe on the stairs. Feng understands how Jang's committee is growing so fast, since he uses such dirty methods as that. But Joe saw coming that this would have consequences, because they tried to recruit Zhen Gao, a middleweight boxing champion, who gave him a very bad time. Upon discovering this, Feng cannot believe that the committee was defeated so easily by a single person, although it makes sense, taking into account that we are talking about a boxing champion. However, Joe relates that Jang is too proud to leave things like that, so he continued to send people to face Zhen Gao, which did not end well since each battle was worse, more brutal and violent than the previous one, but all with the same result. The boxing champion rose victorious in every encounter. Such was his strength that he was recognized by the people and gained several followers. But two of them are particularly well known and feared. One of them is Yengu, a former fan of Zhen Gao, who, according to rumors, participated in clandestine fights for years, in which he became famous for his speed. The second is a burly man named Songse, who possesses superhuman strength according to rumors, and an equally imposing physique, to live up to what is said about him. Along with them, the popularity and respect that Zhen Gao West has achieved has managed to form a group of his own among the neighbors, having as its main characteristic to hate and detest Jang's hypocritical way of acting. Being his main opponents, Joe had learned all this, and as a result, Hank planned to distract people from the conflicts by inciting them to steal supplies from the protagonist. That's why he was on the stairs. He had tried to go up to tell him that they were going to attack him, but the tiredness affected him first and everything ended. As we already saw, Feng understands now why Jang had decided to attack him out of nowhere, since with all the fights that have been going on lately, he starts to have problems. Same reason why he had tried to recruit Joe to be his fighter. At that moment, a creak sounds on the protagonist's door, alerting everyone. But Hao Shingon has his cameras ready, showing the boys that the looters have arrived at the apartment door, but this time much more prepared and armed. The protagonist rushes to run to the door to activate the electrical system, but Hao Shingon stops him before he gets there, since he smells something of sulfur. This only means one thing, and that is that something is going to explode. At that moment, a roar shakes the place and throws everyone to the ground, irritating Feng to see that his friend was right. Hao Shingon also assures that there is nothing to worry about, since the explosives they used are of localized detonation, which means they are not very powerful. Leaving aside how she knows that, the boys look at the scene through the camera, discovering that among the looters are Juina and Hank, clearly working together. Just when Joe was about to go out to face them, the protagonist warns him to stay away from the door, and then connects the generator, activating the security system, which instantly electrocutes the looter who tries to open the door. Seeing this, Jang orders them to place explosives at the junction of the door and the wall, but this time try with twice as many to try to knock down the door. The explosives are detonated as he ordered, but no matter how hard they try, all they manage to do is crack the walls a little, since the door remains intact. Analyzing the situation, Hank realizes that the problem is not the explosives, but Feng's door, and he understands that he had already prepared for all this beforehand, unwilling to give up, and as Joe said, Jang is too proud to leave things like that, for which he orders them to put 3 charges of explosives, exactly where he tells them, and if it still doesn't work, to continue until the door falls, since they must enter his house today. Meanwhile, inside Feng's home, he and Joe put all the furniture on the door, so they don't open it. But as time passes, the explosions become increasingly louder, to the point that the whole apartment rumbles like an earthquake, and they cannot hear each other due to the noise. At that moment, the two friends notice that the door is still intact, but the wall has begun to crack. The protagonist knows that if they continue, the door will not give way, but the cement around it will, and that will open the entrance. That's why he comes to the conclusion that it is useless to cover the door, and instead, he orders his friends to remove all the furniture immediately, since he is going to try an idea that just occurred to him. The problem is that they have put too many things in the middle, and by the time they finish moving them, Hang and the others will have already entered. House Shingon stands between them, and although Joe believes that she will not be of help, she activates her wormhole, with which she absorbs everything around, clearing the way in a matter of seconds. This leaves Joe terrified, because he had never seen anything like that until now. But the surprises are not over yet, since now it's the protagonist's turn, who uses his purple light to make it soft. Just like last time, his idea is to apply the same method as before, to make it even more resistant. But to do it, he needs to coordinate the process perfectly, or else the remodeling will take too long. Fortunately, he has managed to master his abilities a little more, which is why he is now able to control the green and purple lights more easily. With the fusion of both lights, he not only manages to reinforce the wall, but also repairs it. Joe, seeing all this, thinks that Feng is a magician or something like that. But right now, he has no time to explain, since the explosions continue. Seeing the wall, Feng realizes that more cracks have reappeared, which is strange after having reinforced it. Housingen realizes that it is, because now, they have started detonating the explosives from the ground, an area that Feng did not reinforce. Upon noticing this, the protagonist understands that no matter how many times they reinforce the wall, eventually it will fall, for which he decides to try a crazy new idea, but for that he needs his friends to trust him. Fortunately, both Joe and Jay Ozingen are sure that he will save them somehow, giving rise to the plan. After a while, Hank and his team manage to destroy the protagonist's defenses and knock down the door, trained with police riot shields. To protect themselves, Hank warns them to take all the supplies they find, but that they should also be careful, since Feng could be attempting a surprise attack. At any moment, the looters begin to inspect everything, the apartment, but they fail to find anything more than a box of seeds. Not even the protagonist's fire or tools are there, so one of the brothers, Kim, believes that Juina has deceived them. She assures that it is not so, since Feng must have hidden everything elsewhere in the house. The looters continue to explore the place, but very careful not to open the wrong door, so as not to get shot. Upon opening one of the doors, Joe appears kicking the shield to throw the man to the ground, coming out along with the protagonist ready for battle. Feng prepares his toy and points it at the looters, but they use the police bulletproof shields to protect themselves from the shots. The protagonist orders them to leave his house right now, before they make him angry, since otherwise he will not be kind to them. Jang then complains to him about the latter, since he had never seen him be kind to them. Then he begins to do his good boy act, by pointing out that the protagonist has been hiding supplies, and ignoring the suffering of the neighbors, letting them go hungry, for which they have come to do justice, and take everything in the name of the common good. Jang continues to try to convince the protagonist with his speech, pointing out that the only way to survive this is if everyone cooperates together, making him look like the bad guy with every word he says. Feng is very aware that he looks like someone good and noble, but in reality, he is only manipulating them morally, so he cannot trust him. He also knows that right now, the people around him are like wild wolves, who just want to take it out on someone. But if he handles the situation well, he could turn this into an advantage for himself. The protagonist then tries to make everyone see that he has no supplies, since the place is empty. But Juina rises above the crowd to threaten him, and tell that the last time she came, he even had heating, and that if he continues to lie about his resources, then they will all finish him. Out of frustration, Feng shoots at her, cracking the glass of the shield. Then Feng complains to her for having deceived him, since thanks to her, he exchanged his supplies for the seeds, and now he has nothing. This serves to make everyone turn to look at her and believe that she has deceived them. After all, but again Jang calms the fight, willing to try a simple solution. Jang orders his looters to check the rest of the house, since if the protagonist is telling the truth, then he will have no problem about them doing it. But when they leave the room, they discover that there is nothing except for some trash and a girl. This is how Shingon, who being in the middle of the crowd, throws herself at the protagonist to hug him and start acting like a little girl, scared and hungry, while Fong looks like an older brother, worried about her. Seeing this scene, the looters lose the motivation to continue searching, believing that they really made a mistake with the protagonist. Jang is also annoyed with Queen, demanding an explanation from her. Everyone in the group starts to lynch her and threaten her to give them an answer about this big mistake of hers. But Juina doesn't know anything about what's going on either, since she saw with her own eyes how the protagonist had everything prepared for the apocalypse. But now somehow, all his plans went wrong and nothing she saw is there. Juina begins to think that the one behind all this is the protagonist. And full of fury, she comes out of the crowd to attack him. And after dazzling him with her flashlight, she manages to take away his weapon, to threaten him, to tell him where the supplies she saw are. She demands that he tell the truth before she shoots him. But Fong says that all his food and resources were already looted by her, which makes Juina even more nervous and continues to threaten him. Before she can pull the trigger, the looters rush against her and begin to lynch her for having lied to them. Queen assures that she did not do it, but she cannot convince them, and in the middle of the fight, she drops the weapon. Fong tries to pick it up, but Hang is much faster, and just before one of the brothers hits her, he stops him. He again acts as the voice of reason, to give Juina a chance to redeem herself, and then gives the weapon back to Fong, to then invite him to join his group. However, Hank is not in a hurry for his answer, so he just withdraws along with his entire group, where he will wait for his decision. He is happy that things finally ended, because he couldn't stand a second more, being in the intense cold of the real world. And now that they have left the looters without proof, they decide to return to their normal life in the protagonist's apartment. In that way, they put the heating and electricity back on, making everyone feel like it was paradise. Joe didn't expect that the protagonist could do all this in the blink of an eye. But the truth is that everything was thanks to Jo Shingon. With her storage powers, we move on to see some moments before the protagonist deceived them all, when they were preparing everything. At that moment, Fong hid everything in House Shingon's pocket dimension, but this was not enough. So to speed up the process, he asked Joe for help so that together they could open the windows, so that the temperature would drop as soon as possible, and so they could give the illusion that they have not had supplies for a long time. They also needed to barricade the storage door as much as possible, since by doing so, the looting team would spend a lot of energy trying to open it. So as soon as they did and saw that there was nothing, they would get discouraged and stop trying to search their house. Back to the present. The protagonist explains to his friends that the leader, John, is putting on this whole show to keep people under his control. But if they discovered that they had nothing, and they left empty-handed, then they would be outraged and would leave. It was then that what we already saw happened. People began to blame the weakest for not contributing anything, and as it was the protagonist who had the weapon, at the time of the fight, it was Queen who ended up with all the blame. In other words, this was a perfect plan to leave them alone and not keep threatening them with a looting. Despite all this, Joe doesn't think it's such a good plan, since although the protagonist has a weapon, that does not guarantee that they can face so many people. After all, a moment ago, they managed to take it away, and everything went south quickly. Fong acknowledges that that certainly is the worst possible scenario. However, if they get the weapon, again, John would try to resolve the situation peacefully, to maintain his image as a good guy. Joe asks him what would happen if the boss, John, comes up with the idea of using the weapon against him. But the protagonist assures him that even if that's the case, it won't be of any use, since the gun only had one bullet loaded and he used it before. This makes Joe think that everything was on purpose, and that Fong let them take the weapon. But the latter clarifies that it was within his plans. But that does not mean that he is going to let them keep it, since in an apocalypse like this, firearms are very valuable. Joe thinks that what they should do now is pretend to be poor and lacking in resources, while getting rich in secret But the protagonist clarifies that it is not like that, but that his idea is to bring down the neighborhood committee as soon as possible. On the other hand, the neighbors gather where they always do, lining up to ask John for supplies. But it is more than obvious that they are managing with the last that they have left of food. So some people begin to despair a lot, and some manage to sneak inside the supply depot, while two bandits steal supplies from the reserve. The protagonist and his friend arrive to hide nearby. According to Joe's investigation, the first 4 floors are empty, but those on the 5th and 6th house the logistics group of the committee. Unfortunately for them, Joe could not access the 7th and 8th floor, so they have no information on what's there. Since the warehouse could be located upstairs, what they should do now is go up. Joe suggests that he go in front if they encounter guards, and thus while he distracts them, the protagonist can take advantage to knock them unconscious with a stick, asking him to avoid using the weapon as much as possible, since in addition to having little ammunition, they could run the risk of being discovered, and alert the entire committee of their plan. As they climb up the stairs, they notice that there is no one watching the road, which is unsettling, because every floor they advance through is empty. The duo reaches the 7th floor, where Joe no longer feels so sure about his investigation and does not know if the supply reserve will be here. But then he suggests that the two separate, so that each one goes on a path, and let the other know if they find anything, or if they need help. Fong goes his way, and although he thought he should fight, the quiet exploration also pleases him, since it avoids the problems. Before starting his mission, the protagonist explained to his friends that what they should do is to bring down the committee from within, since they are too many to face them directly. Finn came to the conclusion that everyone supports the committee because it provides resources to survive. So if they find the warehouse and empty, then the enemy faction will collapse completely. That is the idea in theory. But the protagonist can't believe it's that easy, since Joe not only finds a door that clearly says warehouse, but also has the key on it. Everything indicates that it is a trap, and it is proven when seeing the doorknob. They see a metal cable, which indicates that something bad will happen if they don't undo the security mechanism, as they already know where the warehouse is located. Fong suggests they leave the ladder for later, and instead, they move on to explore the upper floors. Unfortunately, on the way, they meet looters, so they run away before they catch them, before Joe can receive an attack. The protagonist protects him with his arm, receiving some damage, but giving them enough time to escape and go out to the stairs. Unfortunately for them, someone approaches, so the protagonist goes up along with his friend. But his arm is fractured due to the previous blow, so they need a place to hide. Before they can do so, Joe points behind it, but it's too late, and a hand grabs the protagonist to take him inside the 8th floor. As soon as the mysterious figure takes the protagonist, he closes the door immediately to leave Joe on the other side, who desperately tries to enter to rescue his friend. The man asks him what they are doing there, and Fong explains that they only went up to collect supplies. The man steps on his hand, since it is not so easy to deceive him as they believe, and that is why he gets angry with the protagonist. He realized that they purposely avoided floors 5 and 6, so it is more than obvious for him that they have to know something about the committee and its operation, for which it cannot be that they have gone up to the 8th floor without any idea in mind. The protagonist thinks that this man has been following them all the time, but he clarifies that it is not like that, but that the 8th floor is not unprotected as everyone believes, but quite the opposite. Looking better at the room, Fong realizes that there are a large number of people unconscious around, and instantly he realizes that they are all looters who try to steal food from the warehouse. But this man took care of them all easily, and now it's his turn. Wow. Fong is filled with fear knowing what is going to happen to him. On the other side of the door, a group of the committee manages to see Joe, and they start chasing him up the stairs. The old man clicks his tongue in annoyance and goes to the floor window to open it, which leaves the protagonist completely confused. The old man explains that right now they are only in the replacement of the 4th floor, since the snow has covered everything up to the real one. So if you drop even from this height, it will be enough to cushion the fall and save yourself. What the man is doing is giving him an opportunity to escape along with him, or stay and see the looters of the committee catch him. The protagonist has no time to decide, since the door ends up being knocked down by John's men. And unable to do more, he runs to the window, letting himself fall into the void, but with his purple light ready to save himself, if necessary. The man is surprised that Feng followed him to the ground. But although the two survive the fall, John's men realize their presence, and that's why they're going to chase them. However, the old man returns to his old tricks, and with an elbow, breaks a nearby window so that they can re-enter the building. And this time the protagonist doesn't think twice before following him inside. The men of the committee pursue them, but no matter how many doors they knock down, they fail to find their targets. So they decide to divide into two groups. One will look for them, while the other will go to notify the boss John. On the other hand, the protagonist and the old man are warming up in an apartment next to the fire, and another person. Meanwhile, Feng recognizes that the old man is quite smarter than he seems, since if it hadn't been for him, they would most likely have been caught. And right now, it would be his end. What actually happened was not that they stayed on the third floor, as everyone believed, but the old man warned him to go up to the fifth. He did this because the most rational thought of the looters would be that they would be going down to escape, in addition to the risk of an ambush, in case of continuing down. At first, Feng did not want to go with him, because it was opposed to common logic. But after seeing the results of his actions, now he understands that he can trust him, at least to save himself from problems. The old man asks the protagonist why he is so afraid, but clarifies that what they have next to them is not a person, but the frozen body of A. Confused, the protagonist asks the old man why he helps him so much if they don't know each other. But he replies that he doesn't want to do it, but that he prefers to eliminate him right now, that he has the opportunity. The reason why he let him and Joe live is because they knew how to evade the warehouse trap. So it's more than obvious that they have some knowledge about the committee, which is what the old man is interested in. And that's why he wants the protagonist to tell him everything he knows. But in case he doesn't tell him anything, the old man knows how to get the truth out of him in very creative and painful ways, which scares the protagonist even more to see the type of person he is dealing with. Judging the situation calmly, when it comes to the idea that the old man is there to steal supplies or to have some pending issue with the committee, in which case he and Yo just arrived at the wrong time. The protagonist asks him directly if he has problems with the committee, to which the old man does not deny that it is so, and mentions that John has a secret, which immediately catches the protagonist's attention. This was nothing more than a trap of the old man to confirm if the protagonist knows anything about the committee. And now that he has discovered that it is so, threatens the protagonist to tell him everything he knows, unless he wants to be the second body frozen in this apartment. A while later, the protagonist is saying everything he knows about the committee, including his problem and confrontation with them. After Juina tried to denounce him, complaining a lot about how John and the others went to his house and planted explosives, and then took away the supplies he had. Then he takes his weapon and explains to the old man that his goal now is to go to the warehouse, steal some food and supplies, and then go back to his house. This being a kind of revenge against the committee. Feng actually told him a mixture of truths and lies, hoping that the old man will take his side, relying on the fact that the weapon is real, and that should help him a bit. The old man then clarifies that an old weapon like that does not represent any danger for the committee, since they didn't take the weapon but let him free, is enough proof to believe everything the protagonist told him, which means he is safe for now. Feng asks the old man why John did not take the weapon, because he seems to have more knowledge about how his enemy thinks. He goes on to tell him that there are two possibilities. In the first one, John did it to maintain leadership and continue to look like a kind person who wouldn't hurt a fly. However, in the second one, it would mean that he didn't take it because he didn't need it. Since then, he should have a large amount of more powerful weaponry. The old man believes that the protagonist and his friends are looking to take revenge on the committee, or at least get rid of the latter, since if so, everything would calm down a bit. Feng acknowledges that at the beginning, the committee seemed like a good idea, because it gave supplies to those who needed it most. But over time, and under the leadership of Jian, people began to be guided by the law that the cruelest survives. And even after the end of the world, people totally lost their humanity and could never be reintegrated into society, for which the best option is to destroy the committee, to restore peace. Somehow, the old man mocks and asks what will happen if they destroy the committee. Because this world has always been guided by the law of the strongest, and if they destroy the committee now, things will only end the same as now. And the only difference would be that there would be nothing to guide them. The protagonist doesn't know what to answer to this, but the old man suggests that they ask the person who is watching them behind a door, and upon opening it they throw a bag at him. The old man counterattacks, but that person manages to grab his fist. Before the fight continues, the protagonist stops them, pointing out that who is on the other side is Nurse Jean, and the latter also recognizes him. After everything is clarified, she proceeds to heal the protagonist's arm, stating that her intention was not to spy on them in secret, but that she had received the supplies from Grandpa Lee, that is, from the body of this apartment, and she went to return them, but she found that it was too late. Her plan was to go back to her house, but then she heard someone force the door, and the only thing she could think of was to hide in another room. The old man mocks a bit at how Jean thinks she can save everyone, and states that what happened to Lee is her fault. But be that as it may, Jean doesn't care, since she has faith that only by surviving, they will be able to save as many people as possible. This leaves the old man speechless, but surprises the protagonist more, because apparently, Jean obtained permission from Jin himself to go here and there without problems, and on top of that, he gave her a lot of supplies that he couldn't refuse, because he simply had no reasons to do so. She also tells him that Jian has been throwing out many sick old people, but when she found out what happened to Lee, it was already too late to help him. The old man understands that Jian did this to make the supplies last longer, and that it is the most logical decision, considering that John wants to stay in power. The protagonist, on the other hand, remembers that there is another faction against the committee, and John must be preparing to go to war with them before it's too late. That's why he is leaving the elderly and all those who are not useful. Not to mention that he is so willing to find supplies that he would even use explosives without thinking twice. This confirms before the protagonist and the others that John is going to start a war against the enemy faction. And if that is the case, they need to find his arsenal as soon as possible. The old man questions him what he will do if he does, since after all, he is only against a whole group. But Feng assures that he will take care of everything, even if he has to do it alone. The old man lets him go, but assures him that even if he succeeds, this will only be one of many fights in the apocalypse, and whoever remains at the end will be the only winner. That said, the old man leaves, and as soon as they are alone, Jean asks him to let her help him, because she heard the whole story, and it makes her very angry that they have been so unfair to him. As he cannot refuse her cute little face, Feng decides to set off with her. Moments later, the committee is trying to organize to go look for Feng, but the latter appears out of nowhere in front of them, her face flushed with frustration. Don't say that if you're right. The whole community is in danger. And let's not forget Jiang Shuayu stole your supplies and your women. I'm so angry just thinking about it. Han Feng clenched his fists. I know, he muttered, his voice heavy with emotion. The wind howled through the open window. A calm, steady voice broke the tension. Thank you, there's something I need to ask of you. People whispered in the background. Murmuring about Han Feng, one person spoke up. Are you sure it was him? I'm certain. The other replied, I saw him just yesterday. I wouldn't mistake him, as they moved toward the back of the room. Han Feng wiped sweat from his forehead, the pain in his arm throbbing. He tightened the bandage around his hand, preparing himself for whatever came next. The scene shifted to a desolate, frozen hallway on an unspecified floor. Painful gut-wrenching screams echoed relentlessly, filling the space with an air of dread. These cries of agony belonged to Han Feng, who was bound tightly, his hands and body immobilized. Jean One loomed over him, delivering brutal kicks to his gut without mercy. Mr. Zhang was generous enough to spare you once before. Jean One growled, his voice cold and laced with venom. But it seems you're nothing more than an ungrateful thief. How dare you try to steal our supplies? I'll cripple your other hand and see if you dare to steal again. With a menacing glare, Jean One raised a cold metal rod, prepared to make good on his threat. Just as the situation seemed hopeless for Han Feng, a homeowner barged in urgently. Jean One Glasses Man is calling everyone to gather upstairs. Something's happened. Jean One hesitated, but ultimately decided to leave, his frustration evident He cast one last glare at Han Feng before storming off. Han Feng gasped, seizing the brief reprieve, his body trembling as he lay motionless, waiting for the sounds of footsteps to fade. Moments later, a faint green glow began to emanate from his body, slowly intensifying. Han Feng remained on his back as the healing energy spread, this time enveloping his entire body with each pulse of life. His wounds sealed themselves until he was completely healed, flexing his once broken arm. Han Feng marveled at his recovery, though the process left him so drained he nearly fainted. I'll need to study the limits of this ability. He thought this kind of exhaustion is going to be a problem, determined to seize the opportunity. Han Feng used his purple, hued power to easily break free of his restraints. However, just as he began plotting his next move toward the committee's armory, the sound of hurried footsteps outside the apartment caught his attention. The door creaked open, and with a loud thud, someone was thrown inside. Quickly, Han Feng retied the ropes around his body and feigned unconsciousness. Two voices drifted in as the homeowners resumed their conversation, their words punctuated by the occasional laugh. After a few moments they left, shutting the door firmly behind them. As soon as the coast was clear, Han Feng's eyes snapped open. He turned toward the person lying next to him, curiosity flashing in his gaze. His breath caught when he saw the bloodied and battered face beside him. "Brother Lee," he murmured in shock. The man next to him was indeed Brother Lee, barely conscious and in far worse shape than Han Feng had been. To wake him, Han Feng delivered a sharp slap across his cheek. Moments later, Brother Lee stirred, blinking groggily. Surprisingly, instead of anger, Brother Lee offered a weak smile. "Thanks for the slap," he muttered. His voice hoarse, it did the trick. Brother Lee groaned softly and added with a faint chuckle, "If there's a next time, though, do me a favor, slap the side that's not swollen. I can't feel a thing on the left side of my face right now." Han Feng, his patience thinning, leaned closer. "Enough joking around. What happened on your end after we got separated?" Through muffled groans, Brother Lee began recounting his ordeal. "When you were dragged into that room, I stayed in the hallway. It wasn't long before the committee homeowners started banging on the door. From the sound of it, they were seconds away from breaking in. I had no choice but to unlock the door to the power distribution room and hide inside." He paused, wincing at the memory. "Once inside, I noticed something strange. A big hole in the wall. It seemed to lead somewhere. I figured those bastards would check the distribution room sooner or later, so I crawled down along the wires. I thought it might lead to the parking lot on the first underground floor, but instead it took me to the second underground level." Han Feng listened intently as Brother Lee continued, his voice growing more animated. "There was no one there, but what I found, it was shocking. There were stacks of boxes, all sealed tightly. I opened a few, and they were filled with sausages, each one as thick as my forearm. I was about to grab one for a closer look when I heard a noise behind me. The next thing I knew, I woke up to your slap." Brother Lee's expression shifted. Excitement mingled with suspicion. "But now I understand why the committee acts so arrogant. They're hoarding all that food. Ce sont something. Piles of them." He gestured wildly with his hands to illustrate the size. "Han Fen fromnid skepticism evident so sauce. Are you sure that's what you saw?" Lee hesitated, scratching the back of his head sheepishly. "Well, they look like sausages. There weren't any labels on the packages, but the shape was unmistakable. Now that I think about it, I've never seen sausages that big before." A sense of unease began to creep over Han Feng. "Something doesn't add up," he muttered. "If the committee has so much food, why would they waste resources? Even bombs trying to steal my supplies." A sudden realization struck him. "Lee, did it ever occur to you that the room you found might be Jiang Shui Yu's secret warehouse?" Lee's eyes widened in shock. "What are you saying? Those giants' organs weren't food?" Before Han Feng could answer, the sound of approaching footsteps silenced them. The two froze, listening intently as voices echoed from the hallway. "Glassman is acting strange," one homeowner said, his tone tinged with suspicion. "Why is he suddenly so anxious to get rid of these two? Didn't he always want to win Lee over to his side?" Han Feng and Lee exchanged a petrified glance. It was clear now Glassman had decided they were a liability. The door creaked open and the homeowners stepped in, their expressions dark and cautious. "How were they?" one of them muttered, confused. "Did we go into the wrong apartment?" "No," the other replied. "They're here somewhere. Check under the bed." Unbeknownst to the two homeowners, Han Feng and Li had quietly positioned themselves behind the door, eyes gleaming with determination and a thirst for revenge. They moved swiftly. Li lunged at the homeowner closest to him, his fist swinging with unrelenting force. At the same moment, Han Feng dashed toward the other, his movements a blur of speed and precision. The tables had turned. After subduing the two homeowners and tying them up, Han Feng dusted off his hands and turned to Li. Since Glassman is so desperate to have you killed, we need to go back to that room and find out exactly what's in those boxes. Brother Li furrowed his brow. All right, but what do we do with the boxes once we know what's inside? If they're really important supplies, there are dozens of them. How are we going to move that much stuff? Don't worry, Han Feng reassured him, a sly grin forming. I've already made arrangements. With that, the two left the apartment, heading toward their next destination. Han Feng added, let's meet up with the evil king's true eye first. She might know something we don't. Just as they stepped into the hallway, Han Feng's communication earpiece crackled to life. The voice of the little girl. The evil king's true. I came through Han Feng. She whispered urgently. A woman claiming to be your sister is at the apartment door, asking to be let in. Han Feng's heart skipped a beat. My sister. Yes, the girl replied hesitantly. But there's something off. She came here before, stole your gun, and threatened to kill you. I don't think it's safe to let her in. A grim realization dawned on Han Feng. Holy, that's Li Hyona. He shouted into the device. Don't open the door under no circumstances. Do you hear me? She's not my sister. The connection fizzled with muffled noises before cutting out entirely. Han Feng cursed under his breath. Did she hear me? Is she safe? He tried reconnecting, but the line was dead. Turning to Li, Han Feng spoke with urgency. The secret warehouse will have to wait. We need to check on the evil king's true eye first. The two rushed to the floor above. Cautiously, they pushed the door open, just enough to peek into the dimly lit hallway. It was empty, but noises echoed faintly from further down. What's going on? Li whispered. His eyes, narrowing, the distant noise became clearer as they approached. On the stairwell, Jean Wen's deep voice carried through the air. The injured women and elderly homeowners go upstairs from the left. The rest of you grab your weapons and head to the basement. If they attack us, all our supplies will be taken and my family will starve. We must stop them at all costs. Hiding nearby, Han Feng and Li exchanged confused looks. Is Jean Wen talking about Li Zeng? How? And his crew? Han Feng whispered. I'm not sure, brother. Li replied, his tone cautious. But this chaos is working in our favor. We should blend in with the crowd. Donning masks from their pockets, the two quickly joined the group, their disguises allowing them to slip in unnoticed. The atmosphere grew tense as the crowd edged closer to the commotion on the stairwell. Suddenly, a loud crash silenced the murmurs. In front of Han Feng and Li's shocked gazes, a homeowner was brutally knocked over his body, hitting the cold, hard stairs with a sickening thud. Gripping the stairwell railing stood a man radiating malice. Zhang Yangyu, a member of the committee's army. In his hand, he wielded a long metal pipe. Beside him was Yung Changqi, his expression smug and menacing. The two exuded an oppressive aura that sent waves of fear through the crowd. Even Han Feng and Li couldn't help but feel a shiver run down their spines. The two men stepped forward with confidence, their presence commanding absolute dread. Whatever plans Han Feng and Li had, they knew the situation had just become far more dangerous. The scene shifted to Li Hyona, who was still standing just outside the apartment door, pressing her ear against it. She strained to hear any signs of movement from inside, but the silence was unbroken. Nothing, not even a sound. She thought, her frustration mounting. Was Han Feng even here? Had the little girl lied? Doubt crept into her mind as she began to wonder if Han Feng had actually moved elsewhere. Her musings were interrupted by a voice calling her name. Startled, Hyona turned sharply and was surprised to see Nurse Jean approaching. The nurse's expression was a mix of curiosity and suspicion. What are you doing here, Hyona? Nurse Jin asked, her tone direct. Hyona forced a nervous laugh, masking her unease. Oh, nothing much. I came here looking for something to eat, she replied, gesturing vaguely. Nurse Jin raised an eyebrow. Looking for food, she repeated, her gaze drifting past Hyona. Then why did you bring so many people with you? Hyona stiffened. Behind her stood a large group of homeowners, men, women, and children of varying ages, crowding together with wary expressions. They shifted uncomfortably under Nurse Jin's sharp gaze, some gripping tools or makeshift weapons. The tension in the air grew heavier as the nurse's suspicion deepened. Hyona's weak excuse wasn't going to hold for long, and she knew it. Hyona glanced at Nurse Jin and smirked. "Yeah, isn't it? What are you doing here?" she asked mockingly. Nurse Jin's expression remained calm as she replied, "I'm a nurse. I'm here to treat people." "What's wrong with that?" Hyona's eyes narrowed. "Treat people is Han Feng's sick." She wondered, her suspicion flaring. Then a memory hit her. She had seen Han Feng and Nurse Jean together before in the basement. No, they know each other. She realized. Her gaze hardened as she turned around and whispered urgently to the crowd behind her. "This nurse is with Han Feng." She muttered at her words. Two men from the group stepped forward. They approached Nurse Jin with a menacing air. Nurse Jin immediately noticed their intent and snapped. "What do you think you're doing?" "Mr. Zhang gave strict orders not to disturb me while I'm working." But Hyona smirked. "Ha. Once I catch you, Han Feng won't have a choice but to come out." Ignoring Nurse Jin's warning, the two men grabbed her arms, twisting them behind her back. "Forgive us, Nurse Jean," one of them said mockingly. "Just be patient." Before he could finish, Nurse Jin's voice dropped to an icy calm. "Let me go or you'll regret this." Without hesitation, she grabbed both men by their arms, effortlessly lifting them off the ground. With a swift, fluid motion, she slammed them into each other midair. The two collapsed to the ground, groaning in pain. Hyona and the crowd behind her froze in shock, staring at Nurse Jin with wide eyes. Her strength was monstrous. Brushing off her jacket, Nurse Jin glanced back at the group. "I don't care what you're here for," she said calmly but firmly. "But don't disturb me while I'm working." Hyena, momentarily shaken, quickly recovered. She stepped back and pulled a knife from her pocket. With a shout, she lunged at Nurse Jin. "You monster!" she screamed. Slashing wildly, the knife missed Nurse Jin by mere inches, slicing through her jacket. But leaving her unharmed, Hyona stumbled back, shouting at the group, "This woman is insanely strong. Be careful, everyone." As the commotion escalated, a new sound broke through the chaos. The door to Han Feng's apartment creaked open, drawing everyone's attention. Suddenly, the objects in the group's hands, tools, weapons, even loose clothing, began to tremble violently. The air crackled with an unseen force. "What's happening?" Hyona yelled. Her voice panicked. The items were yanked from their hands, flying toward the open door, as if pulled by an invisible vortex inside the apartment. A swirling portal shimmered into existence. The force emanated from the dimensional gate, activated by the evil king's true eye. The little girl Hyona and her group stood frozen, staring at the door in utter disbelief. The little girl inside Han Feng's apartment formed intricate hand signs with her fingers, her movements deliberate and precise. She looked eerily focused, reminiscent of a ninja from a popular anime. Calmly, she uttered two chilling words: "Almighty pull." In an instant, the dimensional gate surged with immense power. A violent force erupted from the portal, sucking everything in its vicinity toward tools, weapons, and even furniture hurtled into the swirling vortex. "She must be a fan of pain," someone muttered in disbelief. Chaos ensued as the homeowners panicked, their cries for help filling the hallway. "Help!" they screamed, scrambling to grab onto anything stable. Meanwhile, in the dimly lit basement below, Li Jinghao and his crew wreaked havoc, throwing punches and smashing anyone who dared to cross their path. The scene was chaotic, fists flying and groans of pain echoing through the space. Not far from the madness, Han Feng and Brother Li sprinted through the basement corridors, pursued by an enraged fake guy and his lackeys. Han Feng Banting glanced back at their pursuer and shouted, "Didn't we just punch him? Why the hell is he still chasing us?" Brother Li, equally winded, replied between breaths, "That was your punch, little brother." Behind them, the fake guy's swollen face twisted with rage. His left cheek puffed up from Han Feng's earlier punch, powered by the purple light, made him look lopsided and even more furious. "Bastard, I'm going to kill you." Fake guy roared, his voice shaking with fury. More voices echoed behind them. "Hey, Han Feng!" And Li escaped. Someone shouted, hearing this. Brother Li cursed loudly. Damn it, Han Feng's expression grew grim. "If they catch us again, we're finished. We need a plan." Suddenly an idea struck him. He grabbed Brother Li by the shoulder and said urgently, "Brother Li, you go pick up the evil king. I'll hold them off. We'll meet at the agreed spot later. Brother Lee hesitated, his worry evident. Oh, but how are you going to? Don't worry, just go. Han Feng interrupted, shoving him forward. Brother Lee hesitated, but finally nodded and ran off in the opposite direction. Han Feng wasted no time spotting a nearby car. He leaped onto its roof, surveying the approaching mob. People were coming at him from all directions. Their anger palpable. Han Feng smirked, raising his arm toward the ceiling. A brilliant flash of purple light illuminated the dim basement. Listen up, you damn idiots. He shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. Then, with a cocky grin, he raised his middle finger to the crowd and bellowed. I'm the one who drove up the prices in this neighborhood. Starve to death, you poor bastards. The crowd collectively froze for a moment, their faces contorted with disbelief and rage. Too damn arrogant, someone snarled. Kill him, another yelled, and the mob surged forward. Their fury reignited. Han Feng braced himself, ready to buy Brother Lee the time he needed. Han Feng started to run again, his mind racing, although the entrance and exit of the underground parking lot are closed by iron doors. But once the pressure of the snow on the iron gate is released, his thoughts were abruptly cut off. He didn't notice the punch coming from the left. It slammed into his chest with brutal force. He went flying, crashing into the garage shutter with a deafening bang. Gritting his teeth, he stood up quickly, his gaze locking onto the whole pack of people in front of him, each one ready to get him. He can't run away. Now everyone shouted, their voices echoing through the garage. Han Feng winced in pain, his chest throbbing. But he acted quickly, placing his right hand on the garage shutter. He focused his purple light energy into the cold, unyielding metal. The shutter began to glow faintly, its surface softening under the influence of his power. What's happening? Why is the door glowing? Someone gasped, their voice trembling with confusion and fear. Suddenly the light disappeared. The crowd stood frozen, stunned by Han Feng's unexpected move. He smirked, his voice ringing out like a challenge. Come again, you bastards. The next moment, the garage shutter quivered violently. It looked like it was about to explode. Then chaos erupted. A heavy snowstorm burst through the shattered metal, flooding the area in an instant. The howling wind carried snow and ice into every corner. An avalanche, someone screamed in terror. Runaway panic consumed the group as they scrambled toward the stairs. But it was too late. The snow moved too quickly, consuming everything and everyone in its path. For a moment, there was silence. Then a hand emerged from the suffocating blanket of snow. It was Han Feng. He coughed, his breath ragged as he pulled himself up. Snow clung to his clothes as he stood shivering in the icy wasteland, looking down at his trembling hands. His mind raced after softening such a large area. I didn't feel tired at all. Is it because of the increased proficiency? Suddenly a familiar sound came from the left side. Waiting to die here, it was the bearded guy from before. He was sitting beside Han Feng. Watching him intently, Han Feng frowned, confused. Why do I feel like this guy is always staring at me? Someone shouted from the stairs. Hey, the snow has stopped. The bearded man didn't hesitate. He grabbed Han Feng and dragged him out of the snow. This way, he said firmly. They made their way to the corner of the first floor. Han Feng still catching his breath asked, who are you and why are you helping me? The bearded man turned to him, his expression unreadable. I'm Li Jianghao. Han Feng took a step back, his eyes narrowing. Li Jianghao, the one who fought with Mr. John. Li Jianghao moved closer, grabbing Han Feng's hand as if trying to convey trust through his grip. That's right, it was me. Han Feng stared at him, still suspicious. What are you doing? Han Feng extended his hand further. Cooperate with me. Han Feng blinked, startled. Didn't you refuse before? Han Feng shrugged, his face calm but firm. I changed my mind. Han Feng raised an eyebrow and smirked slightly. You suddenly changed your mind. You're not trying to trick me, are you? Li Jinghao chuckled, his sharp eyes glinting. It's just a matter of each taking what they need. Hurry up and do it or don't do it. Han Feng's expression grew serious. He thought carefully, if we can get this guy to contribute, the chances of bringing down Mr. Young will be even higher. Although doubt lingered in his mind, he met Li Jinghao's gaze and said, although I don't believe you, since we have the same goal. He hesitated but eventually shook Li Jinghao's hand. It's a pleasure to work with you, Han Feng said with resolve. The scene shifted to a bone-chilling cold of -2 degrees Fahrenheit. Stepping down into the frosty air, A massive, heavy vehicle loomed in the dim surroundings. Suddenly a voice pierced through the silence saying, "Mr. Jang, the convoy has arrived. You should head upstairs and call for help." The other person responded, "All right, the Jean brothers will go and notify the family members, asking them to come down first." Jean Wen turned to Mr. Zhang, his voice tense. "Sir, the snow has crushed the door to the basement level." Before Mr. Zhang could respond, Jean Wen added grimly, "The temperature plummeted and the crowds were scattering fast." Jean Wen leaned in close to the man with glasses and whispered, "Those two people, they have gone." A voice called out from below. "It's okay," Mr. Zhang replied quietly. "It won't affect our plan." The scene shifted to a dimly lit corner, where a bearded man and Han Feng crouched low. Hidden behind a car, his eyes narrowed as he spotted something unusual. He muttered under his breath, his voice filled with confusion. "Why is there a military jeep in our neighborhood? When did it even drive in?" The bearded man replied with a quiet sigh, "These people must have come from outside. I heard Jiang say before that the residents should be relocated." Han Feng frowned, his expression turning serious. "Where can we even move to?" He muttered, "It's freezing out here, and the snow is only getting worse." The bearded man shrugged casually, a slight grin on his face. "Just ask, and you'll find out," he replied. The bearded man made a swift move, his tone sharp as he spoke. "I leave Mr. Jung to you," he said. Han Feng raised an eyebrow, his voice laced with curiosity. "Hey, what's the rush?" he asked, watching the bearded man move with urgency. The scene shifted once more to the area where the heavy vehicle loomed. A man stood nearby, his voice commanding as he addressed the group. "Everyone get ready to head upstairs. We need to pick someone up." A voice suddenly rose in alarm, speaking to those around. "What's wrong?" Another voice quickly responded, sharp with urgency, "There's an intruder." A man gripping a rod in one hand and a torch in the other shouted to the group, his voice cutting through the tension. "Be careful, don't scatter." While he was telling others to be careful, the bearded man suddenly came close to his face, grabbed his face with his powerful right hand, and pushed him on the ground with powerful force. The other men beside him got scared and started shouting, their eyes scanning the surroundings with caution. The tension in the air was palpable as they positioned themselves ready for whatever might come next. The air exploded into chaos as gunfire erupted, each shot echoing in the tense atmosphere. Amidst the violence, one man shouted over the chaos, his voice sharp and commanding, "Over there, shoot." The atmosphere erupted into a brutal fight, fists flying as men collided in a blur of movement. Grunts and shouts filled the air as they punched and struggled, each trying to overpower the other in the frenzy of chaos. Amid the chaos, a voice cut through the noise, sharp and commanding, "Hey, don't run too far, protect Mr. Jang." The scene shifted suddenly, tension thick in the air, as a gun was pressed to the back of Mr. Jang's head. A cold, commanding voice followed, "Don't move." It was Han Feng. His grip was tight on the gun, the barrel pressing coldly against the back of Mr. Jang's head. Mr. Jang remained calm, his voice steady despite the gun at his head. "I've been waiting for you for a long time, Mr. Han," he said, his words laced with a hint of anticipation. Han Feng's eyes narrowed, a small smirk on his face. "You knew I'd come," he said, his voice cold. Mr. Jung nodded. "Unfazed, of course," he replied calmly. A voice suddenly shouted, "Mr. Jung." It was Jean Wang, but Mr. Jung waved at him and said it was fine. Mr. Jung replied calmly, his voice steady despite the situation. "Before the cold storm hit, you stockpiled a lot of supplies. I thought you were one of their contacts, but it turns out I was wrong." Mr. John slowly reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, his eyes fixed on Han Feng. "Take a close look at the bottom of your pistol," he said, his tone calm yet firm. Han Feng's eyes dropped to the bottom of the gun. As Mr. John pointed it out, his expression shifted bug. He muttered, a hint of disbelief in his voice. How did this guy get his hands on this?" Mr. Johns smirked, his gaze steady. "Do you really think I would have given the gun back to you?" he replied, his voice dripping with subtle amusement. "I know exactly what you want to do." Han Feng's expression darkened, his grip tightening on the gun. "Even if you know now," he said coldly, "what can you do? Who are the they he is talking about? Who is he picking up and why?" Han Feng pressed the gun toward Mr. John's face. "Don't be nervous," he said. "I would have dealt with you a long time ago if I wanted to." Mr. John remained calm, his eyes steady. "You're a smart man," he said, his tone measured. I hope you'll join us as long as we keep sending people to them. We can survive. Han Feng flashed a fake smile, his eyes narrowing with disdain. You want me to be your cannon fodder? He sneered. Sorry. I refuse. That's a pity. Mr. Zhang said with a mock sigh, his expression unreadable. Suddenly a voice cut through the tension. Sharp and unexpected. A man clad in a safety kit and holding a gun had jumped on his feet, causing the interruption. Han Feng's eyes widened in shock as he turned to the guy. Special Forces, he muttered, his voice filled with disbelief. As the force began to open fire, Han Feng immediately darted. Scrambling to find cover, bullets whizzed past him, and he moved swiftly, trying to evade the shots behind him. 3 men, all clad in safety kits, emerged from their hiding spots and began shooting, providing cover fire as Han Feng ran for safety. The chaos intensified as the sound of gunfire filled the air. As Han Feng ran, the bearded man suddenly grabbed him by the neck, yanking him to the side with surprising strength. The grip was tight, forcing Han Feng to struggle for breath as the man pulled him close, his face inches from Han Feng's. When Han Feng saw the bearded man's face, his expression shifted to one of surprise and urgency. What are you doing here? He demanded, his voice harsh. Get out of here now. Han Feng narrowed his eyes, confusion flickering in his expression. Aren't they just 3 Special Forces soldiers? He asked, his voice tinged with suspicion. The bearded man looked at Han Feng with determination. I'll lead them away, he said quickly. You handle the situation. Han Feng's expression turned incredulous. You must be kidding, he replied, shaking his head. They have rifles. The bearded man charged forward, moving with surprising speed and skill. A chaotic scene erupted as gunfire and fists collided. He engaged the soldiers, dodging bullets and delivering swift blows, using the environment to his advantage. The air was filled with the sounds of punches, gunshots, and shouts as the fight raged on. The bearded man fought fiercely, determined to create a diversion for Han Feng. As Han Feng watched the bearded man fight with unmatched skill and precision, a realization struck him. Oh, my God, he thought to himself, his eyes widening in disbelief. This guy is definitely not an ordinary person. The scene shifted once again to the heavy vehicle, where Mr. Zhang was already heading towards the vehicle. His face was set with determination as he spoke to those around him. It's too late. Let's drive up and pick them up. Han Feng watched the unfolding scene with a focused intensity. Slowly, he extended his hands toward the floor, his body radiating a purple energy. The purple force began to soften everything it touched, causing the surrounding objects to bend and shift, as if under a gentle yet powerful influence. The air itself seemed to pulse with the energy, making the world around Han Feng feel malleable, as if reality itself was being reshaped by the purple light. The purple light began to scatter around him, swirling across the ground like an ethereal force. He looked up, his eyes cold. "Want to leave? No way," he muttered, his voice filled with resolve. Mr. Zhang and the others sat in the heavy vehicle as it jolted, struggling to move forward. The driver, confused, tried to steer but suddenly stopped. "What's wrong?" he muttered, his eyes widening. The right side of the vehicle seemed to sink into the ground. "The ground collapsed," he said, his voice tinged with disbelief. Han Feng watched from a distance, his mind racing. He analyzed the situation, his thoughts clear despite the chaos. It seems that if the purple light is used too much, the range will shrink, he thought. It's no longer able to sink both wheels. A man quickly emerged from the vehicle, his movements swift without warning. He hurled a bomb toward Han Feng. The explosion erupted in a flash, sending a shock wave through the air and scattering debris in all directions. The force of the blast rattled the ground beneath them, creating a cloud of dust and chaos. The scene shifted and Han Feng slowly opened his eyes, a slight frown on his face. "It's so itchy," he muttered, rubbing his eyes. Then, with a blink, he sighed in relief, "but it's comfortable." As his vision cleared and he fully opened his eyes, he found himself staring directly at a sheep, its woolly face inches from his own. Han Feng realized he was lying on a soft, red floor surrounded by a scattering of sheets. The strange sensation of sheeps licking him made him jerk his head up. To his bewilderment, he saw several sheep around him, their warm, wet tongues brushing against his skin, curiously nudging him. The Han Feng, still surprised by the sheep's attention, let out a relaxed sigh. "This is so cool and comfortable," he murmured with a smile. "Oh, keep going, don't stop. This feels good." He closed his eyes again, enjoying the unusual but oddly soothing sensation. Suddenly, when he opened his eyes again, he was met with a strange sight. A sheep with an unusually long tongue stared back at him. Before he could react, the sheep quickly wrapped its tongue around him, lifting him off the ground with surprising strength. A bright green light covered his whole body. Because the green light recovers all kinds of damage to his body, the scene shifted back to the vehicle, where Han Feng lay unconscious on the floor. Slowly his eyes fluttered open, revealing an unsettling green glow. He winced, his expression contorting with pain as he pushed himself up. His body was fully recovered in an instant. Jean, when driving the vehicle, glanced at the dashboard, his grip tightening on the wheel. Fortunately, this car has a lot of horsepower, he said, his voice filled with relief. Otherwise, we might not have been able to get out of there. Suddenly, a hand appeared from the side mirror, glowing with a bright red light. Before the driver could react, it was Han Feng's red light. Warm power, but this time it was too intense. Like magma, he just pushed his hand on the armored vehicle, and it was burned like a paper.